Some days I couldn't remember my own name, but I always remembered Sarah's face. Even in the fog, I remembered the one who showed up. Those words would come later, spoken in a courtroom that would change everything. But on this Thursday morning in Brooklyn, as fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune at 5:47, Sarah Chen had no idea that the woman who spoke them was still alive, still thinking of her, still counting the days until they might meet again. The apron tied the same way it had tied 247 times before. Sarah knew the number because she'd started counting on her first day 19 months ago, when this job felt like rock bottom. Now it just felt like survival. The kind of survival that measured itself in small victories, making rent on time, keeping the lights on, not thinking too hard about the patient she'd been forced to abandon. The studio apartment in Bushwick cost $1,450 a month for 412 square feet. The student loan payment arrived with mechanical precision on the first of every month, $523 she didn't have for a nursing degree she'd never finished. This morning, $89 sat in her checking account. 12 days until payday. The math was simple and unforgiving. Her shoes were old, the kind of old that meant pain after the first 4 hours of a shift, the kind that meant another 3 months before she could justify the $70 for new ones. But $70 meant groceries. It meant the difference between eating and not eating. So the shoes stayed and her feet hurt, and she counted the days. Luna's diner had seen better decades. The red vinyl booths were cracked and patched, the linoleum floor worn thin in paths that marked 30 years of footsteps. But it was clean. Doris made sure of that. Clean and warm and filled with the smell of coffee and bacon grease, and something else, something harder to name. The smell of people who had nowhere else to go, finding somewhere to belong. The morning rush would start soon. Sarah moved through her prep routine with the efficiency of muscle memory. Coffee brewing, cream containers filled, sugar packets straightened, small tasks that required no thought, leaving her mind free to wander to places she'd rather it didn't go. Earl would arrive at 6:15. He always did. 78 years old, widower, former accountant, French toast with a side of bacon, coffee, black. He'd sit in the booth by the window for exactly 90 minutes, reading the New York Times from front to back, and leave $12.75 for a meal that cost $9.25. The math never changed, $3.50 every single day. Mrs. Patterson would come at 7, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee with cream. She'd eat slowly, making the meal last as long as possible because her apartment was empty and the diner was not. Mr. Kim at 7:30, the breakfast special, extra hot sauce, always extra hot sauce. Sarah knew them all, their orders, their patterns, the small details of their lives they revealed without meaning to. The wedding ring Mr. Kim still wore 5 years after his wife's death. The way Mrs. Patterson's hands shook slightly when she counted out exact change. The crossword puzzle Earl did every morning, always finishing except for Sundays when the puzzle was too hard, and he'd leave 3 or 4 squares blank. She noticed things. It was a skill left over from another life, another version of herself who'd worn scrubs instead of an apron, who'd worked overnight shifts in a nursing home in Westchester instead of breakfast shifts in a Brooklyn diner. That Sarah had noticed which patients were in pain, which ones were scared, which ones needed someone to sit with them in the darkness between 2 and 4 in the morning when fear lived loudest. That Sarah was gone, or maybe just buried. It was hard to tell sometimes. Doris emerged from the kitchen, moving with the authority of someone who'd run this place for 28 years. 61 years old, widow, mother of 3 grown children she'd raised alone after her husband died. She looked at Sarah with eyes that saw too much. "You're not sleeping again, mija." Sarah tied off a garbage bag, avoiding eye contact. "I'm fine, Doris." "You're not fine." "You got that look, that faraway look. Still thinking about that patient, aren't you? The one they fired you over." The garbage bag went into the bin with more force than necessary. Sarah's voice came out harder than she intended. "I don't want to talk about it." Doris crossed her arms, undeterred. "Some people mark us. They become part of who we are. That's not a bad thing, Sarah. That's what makes you good at this work. You see people, really see them." Sarah finally met her eyes. "And what good does seeing do when you can't help them? Maybe one day you'll find her again. Maybe one day you'll get the chance to help." The words hung in the air between them, prophetic in a way neither could know. Sarah turned back to her prep work, throat tight. Doris returned to the kitchen. The moment passed, but something in it lingered, some premonition neither woman could name. The diner filled as morning broke over Brooklyn, the familiar rhythm of orders and coffee refills, eggs and toast and bacon. Sarah moved through it all on autopilot, her body performing tasks her mind had long since stopped needing to supervise. Smile, take order, deliver food, refill coffee, repeat. But something felt different today. Some electric current in the air, some shift in the atmosphere she couldn't quite identify. The feeling you get before a storm, when the pressure changes and animals go quiet, and you know something is coming, even if you can't see it yet. Earl noticed her distraction. "You okay, Sarah?" She refilled his coffee, forcing a smile. "Just one of those days, Earl. You know how it is." He nodded slowly, studying her with the careful attention of someone who'd spent 40 years reading financial statements and learning to spot what didn't add up. "I do know. And I know that look. That's the look of someone trying very hard not to think about something." Sarah's hand tightened on the coffee pot. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been there." Earl folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "I had a patient once, back when I was young, before I became an accountant. Did my service in Korea as a medic. There was this kid, couldn't have been more than 19, took shrapnel in the chest. I worked on him for 3 hours. 3 hours. Lost him anyway." He paused, looking out the window at nothing in particular. "Thought about that kid every day for 20 years, every single day. Wondered if I'd done something different, moved faster, been smarter. Then one day I realized something. The wondering wasn't helping him. He was gone. But it was destroying me. So I had to let it go. Had to forgive myself for being human." Sarah stood very still, coffee pot forgotten in her hand. Earl looked up at her. "Whatever you're carrying, Sarah, it's not yours to carry alone. And whoever you're thinking about, I bet they'd want you to forgive yourself too." The words landed somewhere deep, somewhere she'd been trying very hard not to look. Sarah managed a nod, not trusting her voice, and moved on to the next table before the tears could start. But Earl's words stayed with her. They mixed with the electric feeling in the air, with the sense that today was somehow different from the 246 days that came before it. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The lunch rush started at 11:30. Different crowd, different rhythm. Construction workers ordering enough food to fuel afternoon labor. Office workers on quick breaks, checking phones between bites. Retirees making their money stretch, ordering soup and coffee and sitting for hours because time was something they had too much of and nowhere else to spend it. At 12:47, the door chimed. Sarah was wiping down table 11, her back to the entrance. She heard the chime but didn't turn, focused on a stubborn coffee stain that wouldn't come clean. Footsteps crossed the diner, the soft whir of wheels on linoleum. A man's voice, cultured and careful. "Excuse me, do you have a table that can accommodate a wheelchair?" Sarah's hand stilled on the table, something in that voice. Something that made the hair on her arm stand up. She turned slowly. The scene imprinted itself on her memory in fragments, each detail arriving separately, building into a whole that stopped her heart. A wheelchair, black metal, institutional but well-maintained. In it, a woman, elderly, fragile, white hair thin and carefully styled. She wore a blue cardigan, expensive but not showy, hands folded in her lap, spotted with age, marked with a scar in the shape of a crescent moon on the left hand, just above the thumb. Sarah knew that scar. Knew it from a story told one night at 2 a.m. about a childhood accident, a pan of oil, a mother's careless moment, and a burn that healed into a permanent reminder. The woman's face, thinner than Sarah remembered. Older, certainly. The years had carved new lines, hollowed new spaces, but the curve of the jaw was the same. The way she held her head, slightly tilted when something caught her interest, exactly the same. And the eyes that Sarah had last seen clouded and confused, and swimming in a fog that shouldn't have been there. The eyes that were now clear, sharp, focused. Margaret Hayes, alive, here, 47 miles from the nursing home where Sarah had last held her hand, last whispered promises she couldn't keep. Last said goodbye without being allowed to say goodbye. The rag fell from Sarah's hand, hit the floor with a wet slap. The sound seemed very loud in the sudden silence that filled her head. Her vision tunneled. The diner fell away. There was only Margaret Hayes, sitting in a wheelchair by the door, looking around the diner with those clear, impossible eyes. Behind the wheelchair stood a man, tall, maybe 6'2", dark hair with silver threading through at the temples, late 30s, well-dressed in a way that spoke of money but not ostentation. Gray suit, white shirt, no tie. His face was all angles, sharp jaw, straight nose, serious mouth. He looked tired, the kind of tired that lives in the bones, that no amount of sleep can fix. Sarah knew that face, had seen it in photographs, in pictures kept under a pillow, treasured like religious relics, in images of a small boy growing older, frame by frame, school pictures, graduation photos, one candid shot of a young man in a suit receiving some award, looking uncomfortable with the attention. David Hayes, the son who hadn't visited in 4 years, the son Margaret had cried for every night, whispering his name in her sleep. The son who paid $17,500 a month so strangers could care for his mother while he stayed away. The son Sarah had hated for 19 months without ever meeting him. The man looked down at his mother, waiting for an answer to his question about tables. He hadn't noticed Sarah yet. Neither had Margaret. They were both looking around the diner, taking in the worn booths and cracked vinyl and the kind of authentic shabbiness that couldn't be faked. Sarah tried to move. Couldn't. Tried to speak. No words came. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Margaret Hayes was in Westchester. Margaret Hayes was lost in a fog that had no ending. Margaret Hayes didn't know who Sarah was anymore, had forgotten her like she'd forgotten everything else. Except those eyes were clear, and they were turning, scanning the diner, landing finally on Sarah. Recognition happened in slow motion. Sarah watched it move across Margaret's face like sunrise, like something waking up. The eyes widened, the mouth opened slightly. One hand rose, trembling, reaching toward nothing. Sarah. The name came out as a whisper, but in the relative quiet of the lunch lull, it carried. Sarah heard it, heard her own name in a voice she'd thought she'd never hear again, a voice that was supposed to have forgotten her completely. "Is that you?" The wheelchair moved forward, not waiting for the man to push it. Margaret's hands on the wheels, propelling herself with strength that belied her frail appearance. The man made a surprised sound, reaching for the chair, but Margaret was already moving. Sarah, louder now, more certain. The wheelchair covered the distance between them in seconds that felt like hours. Margaret's face transformed as she moved. The careful blankness that elderly people wear in public, the mask that protects against a world that often doesn't see them, fell away completely. What remained was raw emotion, joy, relief, something that looked almost like desperation. Sarah's legs finally remembered how to work. She moved forward without deciding to move. 3 steps. 4. Then she was on her knees beside the wheelchair, not remembering how she got there. Her hands reached out. Margaret's hands met them, skin on skin, warm and real and alive. "Oh my God," Sarah's voice cracked. "Mrs. Hayes." Margaret was crying, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, no attempt to hide them or wipe them away. Her hands gripped Sarah's with surprising strength, holding on like a drowning person holds a lifeline. "They told me you left." Margaret's voice shook, but the words were clear, perfectly lucid. No trace of the confusion that should have been there. "They told me you didn't want to say goodbye." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The months of guilt, of wondering, of carrying the weight of abandonment she'd never chosen. All of it crystallized into this single moment. This woman she'd loved, who'd thought Sarah had simply walked away. "That's a lie!" Sarah's voice came out fierce, protective in a way that surprised her. "I didn't leave. They fired me. I tried to come back. I tried to call. I wrote you letters." Margaret's grip tightened. "I never got any letters." Behind them, Doris had emerged from the kitchen. She stood behind the counter, one hand over her mouth, watching. Several customers had turned to look. The intimate moment playing out in public, witnessed by strangers who would later tell their families about the reunion they'd seen at Luna's diner. The old woman and the waitress, who'd clearly meant something to each other once, finding each other again. The man, David, stood frozen a few feet away. Sarah could feel him watching, could sense his confusion. When she finally looked up at him, his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp, assessing, trying to understand what he was seeing. "Mom." His voice was cultured, controlled. "Do you know her?" Margaret didn't look away from Sarah, didn't let go of her hands. "Know her? This is Sarah. My Sarah. The angel who saved my life." The words landed in the space between all three of them. Sarah saw something flicker across David's face. Surprise. Then something more complicated. Something that might have been guilt or shame or regret. It passed too quickly to name with certainty. Doris found her voice. "Sarah, honey." She moved around the counter, approaching carefully. "Is everything okay? You've got customers waiting at table 6. Sarah looked up at her manager, tears streaming openly now. "Doris, this is someone I used to care for. At the nursing home. This is Margaret." Understanding dawned on Doris's face. "The patient. The one they fired you over." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Doris made a decision in that moment that would later seem significant. She smiled, warm and genuine, and waved a hand. "Take your break early, sweetheart. I'll cover your tables. You three go sit down somewhere and talk." "Thank you." The words barely made it past Sarah's throat. She stood, her knees protesting from kneeling on the hard floor. Margaret's hands released hers reluctantly, as if afraid that letting go meant losing her again. David moved forward. His voice was careful, polite. "Would you like to sit with us? We came here for lunch. My mother wanted to come here specifically. She said it was important." Sarah looked at Margaret, questions in her eyes. Margaret smiled through her tears. "I remembered." Her voice held wonder and something else, something triumphant. "Even when I couldn't remember anything else, I remembered you told me about this place, Luna's Diner in Brooklyn. You said if they ever let you go, I could find you here." I remembered. The words reorganized Sarah's understanding of the past 19 months. Margaret had held on to that information, had kept it through the fog, through the confusion, through everything, had held it like a lifeline until the day came when she could use it. They settled into the corner booth, the same booth where everything had started 247 days ago, when Sarah had tied her apron and decided this job was better than no job at all. Margaret on one side with Sarah beside her, David across from them, looking like a man who'd wandered into a conversation he didn't quite understand. Sarah couldn't stop looking at Margaret, at her clear eyes, at the sharpness of her gaze. This was not the woman Sarah had left behind. That woman had been slipping away, losing pieces of herself day by day. This woman was present, here, herself. "Mrs. Hayes." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "What happened? How are you so much better?" David answered, his voice careful. "There was a misdiagnosis. My mother didn't have dementia. She had something called normal pressure hydrocephalus. It's treatable. With the right medication and therapy, she's recovered almost completely." Sarah's hand went to her mouth. "A misdiagnosis? For how long?" David looked down at his hands. 4 years. They told me it was Alzheimer's, progressive, incurable. They said there was nothing anyone could do except make her comfortable. "And you believe them?" The words came out before Sarah could stop them. Not accusatory, just statement of fact. David's jaw tightened. "I believed medical professionals, yes." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "They told me visits would agitate her, that she didn't recognize anyone anymore, that seeing me would only cause confusion and distress." Sarah saw it then. The guilt he was carrying, the weight of it in his shoulders, in the careful control of his voice. This was a man who'd made a choice he regretted, who'd stayed away because someone told him it was the right thing to do, and was now living with the consequences of that choice. "They told me the same thing." Margaret's voice was soft but steady. "They told me you were busy, that you'd moved on with your life, that you didn't have time for an old woman who couldn't even remember your name." David's control slipped. "Mom!" The word came out broken. Margaret reached across the table, took her son's hand. "But I never stopped hoping, never stopped believing you'd come back. Because I knew my boy. I knew the son I raised. And I knew that if you weren't coming, it meant someone was keeping you away." The conversation paused as Doris arrived with coffee. She filled 3 cups without asking, a mother's instinct for when people needed something warm to hold. She caught Sarah's eye and nodded once, a gesture of understanding, of support. Then she retreated, giving them privacy. Sarah wrapped her hands around the cup, needing its warmth. "Tell me everything. How did you find out about the misdiagnosis?" David took a breath. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from the new director at Maplewood Manor, a woman named Diane Chen. She'd only been there a few weeks, but she'd started reviewing patient files. She saw inconsistencies in my mother's case, symptoms that didn't quite match the diagnosis. She brought in a neurologist to do a full workup. He paused, his coffee untouched. The neurologist diagnosed normal pressure hydrocephalus within 2 hours, started treatment immediately. Within a week, my mother was lucid. Within 2 weeks, she was asking for me. By week 3, she was demanding to know why I hadn't visited in 4 years. The timeline clicked into place in Sarah's mind. 3 weeks. Margaret had been clear for 3 weeks before they'd called David. How long had she been treatable? How many of those 4 years could have been prevented? They knew. The words came out of Sarah before she'd thought them through. They had to have known something was wrong. The lucid moments were becoming more frequent. That's why they fired me. I was noticing things they didn't want noticed. David's eyes sharpened. What kind of things? Sarah looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragement. Your mother would have these episodes, sometimes lasting hours. She'd be completely present, sharp, aware. Then she'd slip back under. The staff called them anomalies, said they were false hope, that the disease worked that way sometimes. But I knew something was off. The pattern didn't match what I'd learned in nursing school. And they fired you for noticing. David's voice had gone very quiet. They fired me for caring too much. Sarah's laugh was bitter, said I had boundary issues, that I was too emotionally attached to the patients, that my attitude wasn't a good fit for their new corporate culture. Margaret squeezed Sarah's hand. They escorted her out of the building, wouldn't let her say goodbye to anyone, flagged her in the system so she couldn't come back. I waited for her that night, waited and waited. When she didn't come, I asked the new aide where Sarah was. She told me Sarah had quit, found a better paying job, didn't want to work with old people anymore. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. I would never, Mrs. Hayes, I would never have left you like that. I know. Margaret's voice was absolute. I know that now, but then, in the fog, I believed them. Because what else could I believe? I was forgetting everything else. Why wouldn't I forget how to make people want to stay? The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the diner continued its normal rhythm. Orders called, coffee poured, the mundane world carrying on while 3 lives reorganized themselves in a corner booth. David finally spoke. How long were you with my mother? Before they fired you? 14 months. Sarah's voice was steady now. I worked the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. Your mother arrived in March. I started taking care of her immediately. We connected, she trusted me, she would tell me things. About her life, about you. What did she tell you? David's voice was carefully neutral. Sarah looked at Margaret, asking permission. Margaret nodded. She told me about raising you alone, about working 3 jobs so you could go to school, about how proud she was when you went to Cornell, about the $47 she gave you on moving day, every cent she had from tips that month. She told me you were everything to her. Sarah paused, choosing her next words carefully. And she told me she missed you, that she understood you were busy, that she knew you were successful in changing the world, but that she wished you'd visit, just once, just to see your face. David's composure cracked. His hand came up to cover his mouth. His eyes closed. When he spoke, his voice was thick. They told me she wouldn't know me, that she didn't recognize anyone, that visits would only confuse her. More silence, heavy with things unsaid. Margaret broke it. Both of you stop. She looked between Sarah and David with clear authority. Both of you are carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry. Sarah, you were fired for doing the right thing, for seeing me as a person instead of a task. David, you were lied to by people in positions of authority. You trusted a broken system. Neither of you is responsible for what happened. She sat up straighter in her wheelchair, a steel entering her voice that Sarah remembered from the lucid moments at Maplewood. The people responsible are the ones who lied, the ones who kept us apart, the ones who put profit over people, and someday, somehow, they're going to answer for that. The words hung in the air, a promise, a declaration of intent. Sarah looked at this woman who'd been so diminished by medication and isolation, now fierce and present, and absolutely certain. Something shifted in that moment, something that would have consequences none of them could see yet. David pulled himself together. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for taking care of my mother, for being there when I wasn't. I don't know if I can ever make up for that, but I want you to know it matters. What you did matters." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Would you consider having dinner with us?" David's question was careful, formal. "My mother has missed you terribly. And I think I'd like to hear more about the time you spent together, about who she was during the years I wasn't there." Sarah looked at Margaret. The old woman's eyes were bright, hopeful. "Please," she said simply. "My shift ends at 2:30. Sarah heard herself say the words before she decided to say them. "I could meet you after." David pulled out a business card, wrote an address on the back. 7 o'clock. This is my home. Nothing fancy, just dinner and conversation. Sarah took the card, looked at the address. Upper West Side, nothing fancy. But she nodded anyway. The rest of the lunch service passed in a blur. Sarah moved through her tables on autopilot, her mind replaying the conversation over and over. Margaret and David stayed for an hour, ate lunch, talked quietly. Before they left, Margaret reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand one more time. "I found you." Her voice was full of wonder. "After all this time, I found you." Sarah squeezed back. "I'm so glad you did." She watched them leave, David pushing his mother's wheelchair carefully through the door, Margaret looking back once, smiling, before they disappeared onto the Brooklyn street. Doris appeared at Sarah's elbow. That was something. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "The patient you've been carrying around all this time, she's okay." "Better than okay?" Sarah's voice came out wondering. "She's herself again." Doris put an arm around her shoulders. "I told you, some people mark us, and sometimes we get the chance to find them again." Sarah leaned into the embrace, let herself feel for just a moment the weight of 19 months of guilt lifting. Margaret was alive. Margaret was lucid. Margaret remembered her. And somehow, impossibly, they'd found each other again. The rest of the shift passed. Sarah went through the motions, cleared tables, took orders, poured coffee. But her mind was elsewhere. On a corner booth, on clear eyes, on the phrase that kept echoing in her head. "I found you." At 2:30, Sarah clocked out. Doris handed her an envelope. "What's this?" "Your tips, plus a little extra. You're going to dinner with those people. You should take a cab. You should buy something nice if you need it. You should let yourself have this." "Doris," Sarah's throat was tight. "Take it, Mia. Let yourself be happy for once. Let yourself have this second chance." Sarah took the envelope, went home to her 412-square-foot apartment in Bushwick, looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, the same face she'd seen every day for 247 days. But something was different. Something had changed. She showered, changed into the one nice dress she owned, did her makeup carefully. All the while, her mind kept returning to the same thought. Margaret remembered, through 4 years of fog and confusion and medication that kept her under, through 19 months of separation, through everything that should have erased Sarah from her memory completely. Margaret had remembered, and she'd come looking. At 6:45, Sarah stood on a street corner in the Upper West Side, looking up at a building that was nice but not ostentatious. A doorman nodded to her, confirmed her name on a list, directed her to the elevator. 8th floor. The elevator rose. Sarah's heart pounded. She didn't know what she was walking into. Didn't know what this night would bring. Didn't know if she was ready for whatever came next. But Margaret had remembered. Had held on to Sarah's words through everything that tried to take them away. Had come looking when she finally could. The least Sarah could do was show up. The elevator doors opened. Sarah stepped into a hallway, found apartment 8C, raised her hand, knocked. The door opened. David stood there. He'd changed into jeans and a sweater, looked more human somehow, less like a businessman and more like someone's son. "Sarah." He stepped back. Please come in." She entered. The apartment was comfortable, not a penthouse, not ostentatious, just a nice home. She could hear movement from another room. Then Margaret's voice. "Is that Sarah? Did she come?" David smiled slightly. "Yes, Mom, she came." Margaret appeared from the kitchen. She'd changed too, comfortable clothes, hair down. She looked younger somehow, more herself. She saw Sarah and her face lit up. "You came." As if there'd been any doubt. As if Sarah could have stayed away. Sarah crossed the space between them, took Margaret's hands. "Of course I came. I'll always come when you call." Margaret's eyes filled. "Then let's not waste any more time. Let's make up for everything we lost." And so they did. Over dinner. Over conversation that lasted until midnight. Over stories shared, and laughter, and tears, and the slow rebuilding of something that had been broken but never destroyed. Sarah learned about David, about the man who'd built a company from nothing, who'd worked himself half to death trying to prove he was worthy of his mother's sacrifices, who'd made a terrible choice to stay away, and was now trying to figure out how to make it right. David learned about Sarah, about the girl who'd lost her mother at 15, who'd gone into nursing to honor that loss, who'd dropped out when money ran out and grief became too heavy, who'd found purpose in caring for strangers and had been punished for caring too much. And Margaret, clear and present and fiercely herself, held space for both of them, told them both to stop carrying guilt that wasn't theirs, told them that what mattered now was not what had been lost, but what they'd found. As the night grew late and Sarah finally stood to leave, Margaret took her hand one more time. "Come back, soon, as often as you can. We have so much time to make up for," Sarah promised, and meant it, because this was what showing up looked like. Not perfect, not without pain, but present, real, there. David walked her to the door, waited while she put on her coat, then spoke quietly. "I hated myself for 4 years, for not visiting, for choosing work over my mother, for being exactly the kind of son I swore I'd never be." Sarah looked at him, saw the weight he carried. "I hated you too. For 19 months, I hated you without ever meeting you." He nodded. "Fair. But I was wrong." Sarah's voice was soft. "You were lied to. We both were. The only people who deserve hate are the ones who did the lying." David held her gaze. "Will you help me? Help me figure out who did this? Why they did it?" Sarah thought about Margaret, about clear eyes and remembered kindness, about a woman who'd held on to hope through 4 years of fog, about the phrase that had echoed through this entire strange day. "I found you." "Yes," Sarah's voice was certain. "Yes, I'll help you." They would learn, in time, just how deep the conspiracy went, how many other families had been lied to, how many other patients had been kept in fog for profit. They would learn that Margaret's story was not unique, that what had been done to her had been done to dozens of others. But that night, Sarah just went home to Bushwick, rode the subway in a daze, climbed the stairs to her apartment, lay in her bed staring at the ceiling. And for the first time in 19 months, the guilt that had lived in her chest eased just slightly. Margaret was alive. Margaret remembered. Margaret had found her. Some things you never forget. Some people mark you so deeply that even fog and medication and time can't erase them. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person you thought you'd lost comes back, comes looking, shows up when you'd given up hope they ever could. Sarah fell asleep that night thinking of her mother, of the hospice nurse who'd sat with her through those final days, of the woman who'd told her, "Take care of people, baby girl, show up for them." She'd tried. She'd been fired for it, but she'd tried. And somehow, impossibly, it had mattered. Had mattered enough that a woman lost in fog had held onto her name like a rope, had followed that rope back to the surface, had found her way to a diner in Brooklyn on a Thursday afternoon, and said those 3 words, "I found you." Sarah smiled in the darkness of her small apartment, touched the business card on her nightstand, thought about dinner tomorrow night and the night after, about Margaret, fierce and present, about David, trying to make amends, about the 3 of them, finding their way towards something none of them could name yet, but all of them needed. She thought about showing up, about the cost of it, the weight, the way it marked you and changed you and sometimes got you fired, but also about the way it mattered, the way it echoed, the way it brought people back from the fog. "Some people mark us." Doris had said that, and it was true. Margaret had marked Sarah, had changed her, had shown her what it meant to be seen, to matter, to be remembered. And now Sarah would return the favor, would show up again and again, as many times as it took, because that's what you did for the people who marked you. You showed up, always. The first week felt like learning to breathe underwater. Sarah came to the apartment every evening after her shift at Luna's, still smelling of coffee and fryer grease, her feet aching in those old shoes she couldn't afford to replace. She'd sit with Margaret for hours while David worked in his home office, the click of his keyboard a distant percussion to their conversation. They talked about everything, the books they'd read together at Maplewood Manor, trashy romance novels with shirtless men on the covers, that made Margaret laugh until she cried. The other patients Sarah remembered. Mrs. Chen, who'd sung opera in Mandarin at 3 in the morning. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been a chef and could still describe every dish he'd ever created, even when he couldn't remember his children's names. The night nurse Linda, who'd been kind, who'd brought extra pudding on the hard nights, who'd looked at Sarah with sympathy when the firing happened, but said nothing. Margaret remembered them all now. The fog had lifted, and underneath was a mind as sharp as it had ever been. She remembered conversations Sarah had forgotten, details of stories Sarah had told during those long overnight shifts, the time Sarah had talked about her mother's funeral, about standing in the rain while they lowered the casket, about being 15 years old and suddenly alone in the world. Margaret had held her hand that night, even though she was the patient, and Sarah was supposed to be providing comfort. Some moments transcended the artificial boundaries of caregiver and care recipient. Some moments were just two humans acknowledging shared grief. Now they sat in David's living room with good coffee and actual mugs, not the institutional styrofoam of Maplewood, and they rebuilt what had been broken. Not the same as it was. Nothing ever is. But something new. Something that acknowledged the 19 months of silence and moved forward anyway. David watched from the edges. Sarah felt his presence even when she couldn't see him. He'd emerge from his office to refill coffee, to bring snacks neither of them had asked for, to sit quietly in the chair by the window and listen to their conversation without interrupting. Learning about his mother through Sarah's stories. Learning about the woman she'd been during the years he'd stayed away. On the fourth evening, Margaret fell asleep in her chair, exhausted from the effort of so much remembering. Sarah started to stand, to leave quietly, but David appeared with a blanket. He draped it over his mother with a tenderness that made something ache in Sarah's chest. Then he gestured toward the small balcony. "Stay for a bit?" His voice was quiet. "I'd like to talk, if you're not too tired." Sarah was tired, the kind of tired that lives in bones, that comes from working 2 jobs and carrying grief and trying very hard not to think about all the ways life has disappointed you. But she followed him onto the balcony anyway. The city spread out below them, 8 floors of distance turning car horns into background music and people into abstract movement. Sarah had lived in New York her entire life, but had never seen it from this angle. Her view was a brick wall and sometimes a pigeon. This was a different city, a city of lights and possibility and the illusion of control. "This is surreal," she heard herself say it before she'd meant to speak. "My view is a brick wall, and sometimes a pigeon who sits on the fire escape and judges me." David smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. "How does the pigeon judge you?" "Harshly." Sarah surprised herself by smiling back. "He sits there and coos at me like he's disappointed in my life choices." Which, to be fair, he probably should be. The smile faded from David's face. He looked out at the city, hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "I've lived here for 3 years. This view, this apartment, and I barely notice it anymore. It's just where I sleep between work, where I keep my things. It doesn't feel like much." "That's sad." The words came out before Sarah could filter them. Not having someone to share it with. Not having anyone who cares that you come home. David looked at her. Really looked. His eyes were gray in the city light, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "You see things, don't you? Details other people miss." "Occupational hazard?" Sarah shrugged. "When you take care of people at their most vulnerable, you learn to read what they don't say. Body language, tone, the things they avoid talking about. And what do you read in me?" The question hung between them. Sarah considered not answering. considered making a joke, deflecting, keeping the boundaries professional. But something in his face, some genuine need to be seen, made her honest. Guilt. She kept her voice gentle. So much guilt, it's crushing you. You stayed away because someone told you it was the right thing to do, and now you're drowning in the weight of that choice. David's hands tightened on his mug. Am I that obvious? Only to someone who knows what guilt looks like. Sarah paused. I carried it for 19 months. Still carry it, if I'm honest. The thought that she died thinking I'd abandoned her, that I'd chosen money over showing up. It doesn't matter that it wasn't true. I still feel it. But you didn't abandon her. You were fired. And you didn't abandon her either. You were lied to by medical professionals. You trusted a system that betrayed that trust. Sarah met his eyes. We're both carrying weight that isn't ours to carry. Then whose weight is it? The people who lied, the ones who kept you apart, the ones who made millions while your mother cried for you at night and I got fired for noticing she was getting better. David was quiet for a long moment. The city hummed below them. Sirens wailed somewhere distant, life continuing in its chaotic way, while two people stood on a balcony and acknowledged shared wounds. Can I ask you something personal? David finally spoke. After everything, I think we're past worrying about what's personal. Why did you care so much? He turned to face her fully. You were a nursing assistant making what, $15 an hour? Working overnight shifts that most people quit within 6 months. You could have done the minimum, collected your paycheck, gone home. But you didn't. You stayed with her. You fought for her. Even after they fired you, you tried to get back to her. Why? Sarah felt the question land somewhere deep, somewhere she didn't often let herself look. The truth was complicated and simple at the same time. My mother died when I was 15, lung cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to death. She was a waitress like me, worked the same diner in Boston for 31 years, 6 days a week, never called in sick even when she should have. Sarah's voice went quiet, remembering. When she got sick, we had no money for treatment, no insurance that covered anything meaningful. She went into hospice care in the end. There were these nurses there, these women who sat with her when I couldn't, when it was too much for a 15-year-old to process. They held her hand. They kept her comfortable. They treated her like she mattered, even though she was just another dying woman with no money and no family except one scared kid. She paused, throat tight. I went into nursing because of them, because I wanted to be that person for someone else, someone who showed up, who made people feel seen. Your mother reminded me of mine in some ways, the way she smiled even when she was scared, the way she talked about you, this fierce pride mixed with heartbreak. I couldn't save my mother, but I thought maybe I could show up for yours. David's eyes were bright. He looked away quickly, composing himself. I'm sorry about your mother. Don't be. It was 11 years ago. I've made my peace with it. Sarah attempted a smile. Mostly, some days are harder than others. And that's why you cared so much about my mother. Because someone cared about yours. Sarah nodded. We owe each other that, don't we? To show up, to see each other, to be present for the hard parts because that's when it matters most. They stood in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable, just two people who'd been shaped by loss, finding unexpected common ground. Tell me about your father. Sarah surprised herself with the question. Your mother mentioned him sometimes, said he left when you were 7. David's jaw tightened. Not much to tell. He walked out on a Tuesday morning, no warning, no explanation, just gone. Left my mother with a 7-year-old kid and no child support and no forwarding address. That must have been hard, for both of you. My mother never complained, not once. She just worked. 3 jobs, cleaned houses during the day, waitressed at night, took in sewing on weekends. I'd do my homework in the back booth of the diner where she worked, Sal's place. It smelled like coffee and bacon grease, just like Luna's. He smiled at the memory, but it was tinged with pain. She'd come check on me between orders, ruffle my hair, ask if I needed anything. Her feet would be swollen by the end of her shift, but she never complained, just smiled and asked about my math homework. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. This was why he'd worked so hard, why he'd built a company, why he'd pushed himself until there was nothing left. He was trying to prove his mother's sacrifice meant something. She gave me $47 when I left for Cornell. David's voice was rough, every cent she had in tips that month, and she told me not to look back, to never let anything hold me back, not even her. And you took that literally. I took it like a command, like the only way to honor what she'd given me was to succeed so completely that I never had to look back. Never had to remember the smell of that diner, or the sight of her swollen feet, or the weight of knowing she was working herself to death for me. He stopped, breathed. I built Hayes Analytics from nothing, made it successful, made money, bought this apartment, started paying for Maplewood. And I told myself I was doing the right thing, providing for her, making sure she had the best care. But really I was just running from the guilt of having made it while she hadn't, running from the fact that no amount of money could pay back what she'd given me. You're being too hard on yourself. Sarah's voice was gentle. You were trying, in the way you knew how. I was a coward. David met her eyes. I could have visited, should have, but watching her forget me, watching the dementia take her piece by piece, that was pain I couldn't survive. So I paid strangers to deal with it. Paid you to show up so I didn't have to. Sarah felt anger flash through her, surprising in its intensity. You didn't pay me to show up. Nobody paid me enough for what I gave. I showed up because I wanted to. Because your mother deserved it. Because showing up is what we owe each other. David looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. I'm starting to understand that. You're teaching me that. You and my mother. What it means to actually be present. To show up even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, Sarah corrected. That's when it matters most. The conversation faded into comfortable silence. They stayed on the balcony until the cold drove them inside. Margaret was still sleeping in her chair, breathing softly. Sarah gathered her things to leave, but David stopped her at the door. Come back tomorrow, and the day after. My mother is happier than I've seen her in years. Because of you. Because you showed up. Sarah nodded. I'll come, as often as I can. She rode the subway home to Bushwick thinking about the conversation. About guilt and grief, and the ways people tried to outrun pain that had nowhere to go except through. David Hayes wasn't the villain she'd imagined for 19 months. He was just a man who'd made a terrible choice for understandable reasons, and was now trying to figure out how to live with the consequences. The weeks developed a rhythm. Sarah's shift at Luna's ended at 2:30. She'd go home, shower, change into clothes that didn't smell like fryer grease, and take the subway to the Upper West Side. She'd arrive around 4, stay until 10 or 11, sometimes later. Margaret bloomed under the attention. Color returned to her cheeks, strength to her movements. She started walking short distances with a walker, determined to regain what the medications and isolation had stolen. Sarah would walk with her, pace matching pace, ready to catch her if she stumbled, but never hovering. One evening, Margaret spoke of the fog, described it in detail she'd never been able to articulate before. It was like being underwater. I could see shapes moving above me, hear voices, muffled and distant, but I couldn't reach them, couldn't break surface. The medication kept pulling me down. Every time I'd fight toward consciousness, toward clarity, they'd adjust my dosage and I'd sink again. Sarah listened, hands folded in her lap, throat tight. How often were you lucid? Really lucid? More often than they said. Margaret's voice was certain, especially in the last year. I'd have hours, sometimes whole days, where I was myself. I'd beg the staff to call David, to let me talk to him. They'd say he was busy, that he didn't want to be disturbed, that I should rest. Did they tell you he was trying to call? Sarah already knew the answer, but needed to hear it confirmed. No. Margaret's hands clenched. They told me he'd moved on, that he was too important now for an old woman who couldn't even remember his name. And I believed them, because what else could I believe? David had stopped working so much. He'd cleared his schedule for the first 2 weeks. Something Sarah learned was unprecedented. His assistant called constantly. Emails piled up, but he ignored them. Told his COO to handle everything. Told the board he was taking emergency family leave. On the 10th day, Sarah arrived to find him in the kitchen attempting to cook. The results were optimistic at best. Eggs that were somehow both burnt and runny. Toast that set off the smoke alarm. Coffee that tasted like regret. What are you doing? Sarah couldn't help but smile at the disaster. Making breakfast. David looked at the pan with betrayal. Or trying to. I watch cooking shows. It doesn't look this hard on television. You're a CEO of a successful company and you can't cook eggs? I have people for that. Usually. Had people. He corrected himself. I'm trying to learn to do things for myself. Normal people things. Sarah took the spatula from his hand. Here, let me show you. They stood side by side at the stove, Sarah's hands guiding his through the process. How to crack an egg without getting shell in it. How to scramble gently, not aggressively. How to know when to take the pan off heat. Small skills that felt enormous in their intimacy. Margaret watched from her chair with a knowing smile that made both of them uncomfortable. She'd been making comments for days about how lovely Sarah's eyes looked in certain light, about what a handsome couple they made, about how she'd always wanted grandchildren and was running out of time. She's matchmaking, Sarah whispered when Margaret left the room. She's not exactly subtle about it. I noticed. David kept his voice equally quiet. Should we tell her to stop? Sarah looked at him, really looked, saw the man behind the guilt, someone who was trying, genuinely trying to be different, to show up, to learn how to be present. It scared her, that warmth, the way her chest tightened when he smiled, the way she'd started looking forward to these evenings not just for Margaret, but for him too. Maybe not, she heard herself say. Maybe she sees something we're too scared to admit. David met her eyes. And what would that be? That we're both scared, that we've both been hurt, that maybe scared and hurt together is better than scared and hurt alone. The air between them shifted. Something acknowledged without being named. David's hand moved toward hers on the counter, stopped halfway, uncertainty clear in his face. Sarah made the decision. Close the distance. Let their fingers touch. Margaret's voice from the other room. Are those eggs done? I'm starving. They broke apart, both smiling, both uncertain, both aware that something had changed and neither knowing quite what to do about it. The kiss happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after their reunion. Margaret had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion, but winking at Sarah in a way that suggested orchestration. David walked Sarah to the door as he always did, but this time, in the doorway, with the city night behind her and his apartment warm in front, something clicked into place. Sarah rose on her toes, kissed him gently, pulled back before he could respond. I'm still scared. Her voice was barely above a whisper. David's hand came up to her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. Me too. The second kiss was longer, deeper. His hands in her hair, her hands fisted in his shirt, both of them breathing hard when they finally broke apart. What are we doing? Sarah's question hung between them. I don't know. David's forehead rested against hers. But I know I don't want it to stop. They stood in the doorway for a long moment. Two people who'd been brought together by circumstance, by lies, by a woman who remembered kindness through 4 years of fog. Two people who were learning how to show up, how to be present, how to risk being hurt because the alternative was being alone. Your world is very different from mine. Sarah finally spoke. I make $28,000 a year. I live in a 412 square foot apartment that I can barely afford. I have $47,000 in student debt. My shoes have holes in them. Our lives don't match. David pulled back enough to meet her eyes. I don't care about matching. I care about this, about you, about learning to be someone who actually shows up instead of writing checks and calling it love. That's easy to say now, in the moment. But your life is board meetings and business trips and a world I don't understand. What happens when reality sets in? Then we figure it out. Together. He took her hands. I spent 4 years running from pain, from responsibility, from actually being present. I'm not going to run from this. From you. Not unless you tell me to. Sarah searched his face for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was temporary. Found only sincerity and the same fear she was feeling. Maybe being scared means it matters. Maybe it does. David smiled slightly. So we're doing this, whatever this is? We're trying. Sarah squeezed his hands. No promises, no expectations, just trying to show up for each other and seeing what happens. I can do that. I'm learning how. They kissed again, softer this time. A promise instead of a question. When Sarah finally left, riding the subway back to Bushwick, she couldn't stop smiling. Scared, yes. Uncertain, absolutely. But also something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The sixth week brought a phone call that changed everything. Sarah was at Luna's, covering the morning shift for a coworker when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Westchester area code. She almost didn't answer. Almost let it go to voicemail. But something made her step into the back alley, away from the noise of the diner, and pick up. Hello? Silence on the other end. Then a woman's voice, low and urgent. Sarah Chen? Yes, who is this? My name is Linda Rodriguez. I worked nights at Maplewood with you. I need to talk to you. About Mrs. Hayes. About what really happened there. Sarah's heart started pounding. Linda, I remember you. You brought Margaret extra pudding. Listen. Linda's voice was shaking. I can't talk long. I'm at work and they monitor everything. But I found something. Documents. Hidden in the old administrator's office. Things that explain why you were fired. Why Mr. Hayes was kept away. It's bad, Sarah. It's really bad. What kind of documents? I can't say over the phone. But I'm sending them to you. Your old address from the employee file. If you still live there, you should get them in a few days. A pause. I should have done this sooner. Should have said something when they fired you. I'm sorry. Linda, wait, what is this about? The line went dead. Sarah stood in the alley behind Luna's, phone in hand, heart racing. Documents. Hidden. Things that explain the firing, the separation. It's bad, Sarah, really bad. She called David immediately, told him about the call. He went very quiet on the other end of the line. Then his voice, controlled but tight, was something that might have been anger or fear or both. Don't open anything when it arrives. Call me first. We'll look at it together. You think it's serious? I think someone doesn't hide documents unless those documents are damaging. And I think if they're willing to fire you for noticing my mother was improving, they're willing to do a lot worse to protect whatever they're hiding. The days waiting for the envelope felt like weeks. Sarah went through her routines mechanically, worked her shifts, visited Margaret and David in the evenings, but her mind kept returning to Linda's shaking voice. It's bad, really bad. Margaret sensed something was wrong. You're distracted. What's bothering you? Sarah didn't want to worry her. Nothing. Just tired. Don't lie to me. Margaret's voice was sharp. I spent 4 years in a fog, but I'm clear now and I can see when something's wrong. What is it? Sarah looked at David. He nodded slightly. They'd agreed to tell her if anything developed. She deserves to know. It's her life. So Sarah explained about the call, about Linda and the documents and the promise that answers were coming. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, the old woman sat very still for a moment. Good. Her voice was steel. I want to know. I want to know exactly who did this to me. Who kept me away from my son? Who fired Sarah for caring? I want names. And then I want justice. David looked at his mother with something like awe. You're sure? This might be hard, might drag up everything you've been trying to move past. I'm not moving past anything. Margaret's eyes were fierce. I'm moving through it. There's a difference. Moving past means pretending it didn't happen. Moving through means facing it, understanding it, and making sure it never happens to anyone else. Sarah felt something solidify in her chest. This woman, 73 years old, stolen from for 4 years, medicated into fog kept from her son, and her response wasn't to hide or heal quietly. Her response was to fight. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Sarah found it in her mailbox when she got home from her shift. Thick manila envelope, no return address, postmarked Westchester. Her hand shook as she carried it up the stairs to her apartment. She set it on her small kitchen table and stared at it for a full minute before calling David. It's here. Don't open it. I'm coming to you. He arrived 20 minutes later, 45 minutes faster than the subway should have allowed. Must have taken a cab, expensive on a Tuesday afternoon. He looked at the envelope on Sarah's table like it might explode. Together? He held out his hand. Sarah took it. Together. They opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of documents, memos, emails, medical records with notes in the margins. Sarah started reading, got through the first page, the second. By the third, her hands were shaking so hard she had to set the papers down. Oh my God! Her voice was barely above a whisper. David, they knew. They knew she was getting better. They knew the diagnosis was wrong. And they kept her sedated anyway. David read over her shoulder, his face going white. This memo is from 3 years ago. 3 years. They've known for 3 years. Sarah picked up another document, read it aloud, needing to hear the words to believe them. From Dr. Richard Thornton, Medical Director. Continue current sedation regimen. Patient's lucid episodes becoming more frequent. Recommend maintaining dementia diagnosis. Monthly payments from Mr. Hayes represent significant revenue. Improvement could result in transfer to lower care facility. David's voice was deadly quiet. They kept my mother sick because I was paying them $17,500 a month. They chose profit over her life. Sarah kept reading, found the next document, felt her stomach drop. David, look at this. These are emails from you. What? She handed him the papers, watched his face as he read, watched recognition turn to horror, turn to rage. These are from 2 years ago. I sent these. I was trying to reach her, trying to visit. They told me no every time. The emails were heartbreaking in their consistency. David requesting visits, requesting updates, requesting video calls. Every single one denied with professional language and medical justifications. Family visits agitate the patient. Her dementia has progressed. Video calls only cause confusion. We recommend continued no-contact protocol. And then, at the bottom of the pile, one more email. Handwritten note attached. David's last attempt, 18 months ago. His desperation clear in every word. I understand visits aren't possible given Mom's condition, but I need you to do something for me. Please tell her I love her. Please tell her I think about her every single day. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't keep her home. Tell her she's everything to me. If anything changes, any improvement at all, call me immediately. I would give everything I have to see her smile at me one more time. Please don't let her think I've forgotten her. Below his message, in different handwriting. Do not respond. Do not pass to patient. File with other Hayes correspondence. No action. Sarah watched David read his own words. Watched him understand, viscerally, how completely he'd been betrayed. His hands clenched on the paper. His jaw worked. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. I begged them to tell her I loved her. And they filed it away, like it meant nothing, like she meant nothing. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. For David, for Margaret, for herself, for every family that had trusted Maplewood and been betrayed. They kept you apart on purpose. They knew you were trying. They knew she was asking for you. And they deliberately kept you separated. David stood abruptly, started pacing Sarah's small apartment. I paid them $800,000 over 4 years. $800,000. And they used that money to keep me away from my own mother, to keep her drugged, to keep her isolated. He turned to Sarah, and the rage in his eyes was terrible to see. I want to burn that place to the ground. I want to find everyone who was involved and make them pay. I want to destroy them the way they destroyed us. Sarah understood the rage, felt it herself, hot and sharp and righteous. But underneath it was something else, something that felt like purpose clicking into place. We need to tell Margaret. Her voice was steady. She deserves to know. And then we need to figure out what to do about this. David ran his hands through his hair. She's been through so much already. Do we really need to put her through this too? She specifically said she wanted to know. Sarah stood, gathering the documents. She said she wanted names and justice. We owe her the truth. They took a cab to the Upper West Side, rode in silence, the envelope of documents between them like a bomb. Margaret was reading when they arrived. She looked up, saw their faces, and set her book aside immediately. Tell me. No preamble. All, no softening, just direct demand. So they told her, showed her the documents, the memos planning her continued sedation, the emails from David that were never passed along, the systematic, deliberate conspiracy to keep them apart for profit. Margaret read everything. Her face didn't change, didn't crack. She just kept reading, methodical and thorough, until she'd seen every page. When she finished, she set the documents down carefully, folded her hands in her lap, looked at both of them with eyes that were absolutely clear. How many others? Her voice was steady. If they did this to me, if they kept me sedated for revenue, they must have done it to others. How many? We don't know yet. David's voice was hoarse. But we're going to find out. Good. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Then we're going to stop them. We're going to make sure they can never do this to anyone else. Sarah looked at this woman, 73 years old, 4 years stolen, medication forced on her, son kept away, friend fired. And her response wasn't to retreat or heal quietly. Her response was to fight, to make sure no one else went through what she went through. We'll need lawyers. David was already thinking tactically. Good ones. This is going to be complicated, expensive, could take months or years. I don't care how long it takes. Margaret's voice was absolute. They took 4 years from me, from us. They can't have any more. She looked at Sarah. Will you help? Will you tell them what you saw, what you remember? Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, whatever you need, I'll tell them everything. Margaret reached out, took both their hands. Then let's get started. Let's show them what happens when you underestimate the ones who show up. They worked late into the night, made lists of what they knew, what they needed to find out. David called his attorney, left a message marked urgent. Sarah tried to remember every detail from Maplewood, every policy that seemed off, every moment when she'd questioned the care protocols, every patient who'd shown improvement only to suddenly decline after medication adjustments. Around midnight, exhausted and overwhelmed, they finally stopped. Sarah and David sat on the small balcony while Margaret slept. The city glittered below them, unaware that 3 people in one apartment were planning to tear down a system that had betrayed them. This is going to be hard, Sarah spoke quietly. For all of us, but especially for your mother, reliving everything, testifying probably, facing the people who did this to her. I know, David's voice was tired, but did you see her face? She's not scared. She's ready. She wants this fight. She's remarkable. She is. He turned to look at Sarah. And so are you. You could have walked away from all of this, could have stayed out of it, but you're choosing to stand with us. Where else would I be? Sarah met his eyes. This matters. What they did matters. And if we don't fight, they'll just do it to someone else. David took her hand. We're really doing this. Taking on a healthcare corporation, exposing fraud, probably making powerful enemies. We are. Sarah squeezed back, together. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 people who'd been brought together by lies and were now bound by truth. 2 people learning what it meant to show up, not just in the good moments, but in the hard ones, the scary ones, the ones where the cost of showing up might be everything. I'm glad you're here. David's voice was soft. I'm glad you showed up. For my mother. For me. Even when you had every reason not to. Sarah leaned into him. Someone told me once that showing up is what we owe each other, especially when it's hard. I'm just trying to live up to that. They stayed on the balcony until the cold drove them inside. Sarah gathered her things to leave, but David stopped her. Stay. It's late. You can take the guest room, or stay. The choice hovered between them, weighted with meaning. Sarah looked at him. At this man who was learning how to be present, who was trying, genuinely trying, to be different. I'll stay. In the guest room, I'm not ready for more than that yet. I understand. The relief on his face was genuine. No pressure, no expectations, just glad you're here. She stayed, slept in the guest room in borrowed clothes, woke to the smell of coffee and David's voice quietly talking to his mother. Found them in the kitchen, Margaret animated and sharp, David attempting breakfast with more success than before. They looked up when she entered, smiled, made room for her at the table. And Sarah thought about how strange this was, how unexpected. 3 people who shouldn't be together, brought together by lies and medication and a system that valued profit over people. But here they were, making breakfast, making plans, making something that felt almost like family. The fight ahead would be hard, would cost them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But in that moment, in that kitchen, with weak morning light and burnt toast and coffee that was finally drinkable, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she belonged, like she was part of something that mattered, like showing up, despite the cost, had brought her to exactly where she needed to be. Margaret looked at both of them. Ready? Sarah and David exchanged glances, nodded together. Ready, they spoke in unison. And the real fight began. The attorney's office occupied the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown that smelled like expensive carpet and other people's money. Victoria Chen was 52, impeccably dressed, and had the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd been practicing medical malpractice law for 26 years, had seen things that would make most people lose faith in humanity. But something about the documents spread across her conference table made her go very still. "This is worse than I thought." Her voice was controlled but tight. "Much worse." David sat across from her, Sarah beside him, Margaret in her wheelchair at the head of the table. They'd been in this office for 3 hours, walking Victoria through everything: the timeline, the medications, the blocked communications, the systematic isolation. Now she was reading the documents Linda had sent, her expression growing darker with each page. "How many cases like this have you seen?" David's question hung in the air. Victoria looked up. "In 26 years? Maybe a dozen that come close to this level of deliberate fraud. But the documentation here, the paper trail, it's unprecedented. Most places are smart enough not to write down their crimes." She picked up one particular memo. "This is from Dr. Richard Thornton to the administration. 3 years ago. He's explicitly stating that your mother's lucid episodes are increasing, that the dementia diagnosis may be incorrect, and that they should maintain the current treatment protocol anyway. That's not negligence. That's conspiracy." Margaret leaned forward. "Can we prove it? With these documents?" "Yes," Victoria's voice was certain. "But we'll need more. We'll need medical experts to review your records. We'll need testimony from staff who witnessed what happened. We'll need to establish a pattern of behavior beyond just your case." "There are others." Sarah spoke quietly. "I know there are. I saw things at Maplewood that didn't make sense. Other patients who improved then suddenly declined. Families who were told to stay away." Victoria made a note. "We'll need you to document everything you remember. Every patient, every conversation, every policy that seemed wrong." She looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Hayes, this is going to be invasive. They'll question everything about your condition, your memory, your credibility. They'll try to make you look confused, unreliable. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret's spine straightened. "I spent 4 years being told I was confused, being treated like I couldn't understand what was happening to me. I'm done being silent. I'm done being invisible. Let them try to discredit me. I dare them." Victoria smiled slightly. "Good, because we're going to need that strength. This isn't going to be quick or easy. Healthcare corporations have armies of lawyers. They'll fight every step of the way." "How long?" David asked. "Months, maybe a year, maybe longer." Victoria's honesty was brutal, and it's going to cost. "I'll need a retainer of $200,000 to start. Full litigation could run into millions." David didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes. Money isn't the issue. Justice is." They left the office at sunset, the city turning golden in the late afternoon light. Sarah felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. The weight of what they were undertaking was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about Margaret anymore. This was about every patient who'd been betrayed, every family who'd been lied to, every person still sitting in Maplewood Manor right now, possibly being sedated for profit. The scope of it was overwhelming. They went back to David's apartment, ordered food none of them ate, sat in the living room with documents spread across every surface, trying to make sense of the enormity of what they'd uncovered. Margaret fell asleep in her chair around 9, exhausted from the day. David covered her with a blanket, then joined Sarah on the balcony. "Are we really doing this?" His voice was quiet. "Taking on a healthcare corporation. Exposing fraud that goes back years. Probably making enemies who have a lot more power than we do." Sarah looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, in Westchester, Maplewood Manor was still operating, still medicating patients, still collecting checks from families who trusted them, still lying to everyone who asked questions. "Yes, we're really doing this. What if we fail? What if they're too big to fight? Then we fail trying." Sarah turned to face him. "But at least we tried. At least we showed up and said this matters, that she matters, that all of them matter. That's more than most people do." David reached for her hand, found it, held it. "When did you become so brave?" "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being scared. Tired of watching bad things happen and feeling powerless. Your mother is giving me a chance to do something that matters, to use what happened to me for something good. I'm not going to waste that." They stood in silence for a while. The city hummed below them, unaware that 3 people in one apartment were planning to tear down a system that had betrayed thousands. Finally, David spoke again. "Move in with us." The words came out rushed, uncertain. "Not because of anything romantic, not because I'm expecting anything, but because this is going to take months and you shouldn't have to commute from Bushwick every day. We have the guest room. My mother wants you here. And honestly, I want you here too." Sarah felt the offer land somewhere deep. The practical part of her brain did quick math. Rent saved, subway costs eliminated, more time to work on the case. But underneath the practical was something else. The knowledge that moving in would change things, would make this real in a way it wasn't yet, would mean committing not just to the fight, but to this strange family they were building. "Let me think about it." She squeezed his hand. "It's a big step. No pressure, whenever you're ready. Or never. The offer stands either way." But Sarah was already thinking about her apartment in Bushwick. 412 square feet of loneliness and bills she could barely pay. No one waiting for her there. Nothing but reminders of all the ways life had disappointed her. And here was an offer of something different, something that felt almost like belonging. 2 days later, she said yes, moved her few possessions into the guest room, hung her 3 dresses in the closet, set her mother's photograph on the nightstand. And just like that, her life reorganized itself around this fight and these people and the growing certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The investigation began in earnest. Victoria hired private investigators, former FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes. They started digging into Maplewood's records, into Health Corp's corporate structure, into the money trail that connected patient care to profit margins. What they found made Victoria call an emergency meeting. "It's bigger than we thought." She laid out spreadsheets across the conference table. 23 patients over 6 years, all with wealthy families, all diagnosed with progressive dementia or similar conditions, all kept at Maplewood longer than medically necessary. The billing pattern is consistent across all of them. Sarah's stomach dropped. 23. That many people had been betrayed. That many families lied to. "It gets worse." Victoria's voice was grim. 6 of those patients died while in Maplewood's care. The investigators pulled death certificates. Causes of death include falls, infections, complications from medications, all things that might have been prevented with proper care. David's face had gone white. "They killed people. For profit. They actually killed people. We can't prove the deaths were intentional." Victoria held up a hand. "But we can prove neglect. We can prove that patients were kept sedated beyond medical necessity. We can prove that families were systematically deceived. And we can prove a pattern of behavior that prioritized revenue over care." Margaret spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched. "Those 6 people, do they have families? People who should know what happened?" Victoria nodded. "We're reaching out to them. Carefully. Some may want to join the lawsuit. Some may not be ready to hear the truth." "Tell them." Margaret's voice left no room for argument. "Tell them all. They deserve to know, even if the truth hurts. Even if they're not ready. They deserve to know their loved ones were betrayed." The next week brought a parade of families. People who trusted Maplewood with their parents, their spouses, their siblings. People who'd been told that visits would agitate, that phone calls would confuse, that the best thing they could do was stay away and let the professionals handle it. They came to Victoria's office with old grief reopened, with rage that had nowhere to go, with questions that had no good answer. Sarah sat through some of those meetings, listened to stories that echoed Margaret so closely it was painful. A daughter who tried to visit her father every week, turned away every time, told he didn't recognize her anymore. A son who'd called daily, never allowed to speak to his mother, assured she was comfortable. A wife who'd begged to take her husband home, told he needed round-the-clock care that only Maplewood could provide. All of them lied to. All of them kept away. All of them still carrying the guilt of not being there at the end. One woman stood out. Patricia Morrison's mother had died at Maplewood 2 years ago. Patricia was 43, a teacher, had spent her entire savings paying for care she thought was the best available. She sat in Victoria's office and listened to the explanation of what had really happened. When Victoria finished, Patricia sat in silence for a long moment. "My mother asked for me." Her voice was barely audible. "The night before she died, the nurse called and said Mom was asking for me. I drove from Boston, 4 hours, got there at 2 in the morning. They wouldn't let me in, said she was sleeping, that I should come back in the morning. I left. I actually left, and she died before sunrise." The tears came then, harsh, broken sobs. "I could have been there. I could have held her hand, told her I loved her. But I listened to them. I trusted them. And she died alone, thinking I didn't care enough to come." Sarah couldn't help herself. Crossed the room, knelt beside Patricia's chair, put arms around a stranger who was living the nightmare Sarah had feared for 19 months. "You didn't know. Your mother knew you loved her. She knew." But Patricia couldn't be comforted. None of them could, really. The guilt of absence, even when that absence was forced, was a wound that didn't heal easily. Sarah understood that better than most. The investigation turned up another crucial piece. The money trail led directly to Health Corp's executive compensation structure. Administrators received bonuses based on occupancy rates and billing levels. The longer patients stayed, the more medication they received, the higher the bills, the bigger the bonuses. It was a system designed to incentivize exactly the kind of fraud they were uncovering. Dr. Richard Thornton's role became clearer. The investigators dug into his background, found gambling debts, found pressure from Health Corp executives, found emails that suggested he knew what he was doing was wrong, but felt trapped. It didn't excuse his choices, but it complicated the narrative, made him less of a villain and more of a person who'd made terrible decisions under pressure and then couldn't find a way out. Sarah thought about that a lot, about the ways systems corrupted people, about how someone could start with good intentions and end up doing unconscionable things, about the distance between the person you want to be and the person circumstances force you to become. But then she'd think about Margaret, about 4 years stolen, about David's blocked emails, about her own firing, and the compassion would harden back into anger. Thornton had choices. Everyone had choices. He chose money over people, chose comfort over conscience, and people died because of it. They needed to find Linda Rodriguez, the woman who'd sent the documents, who'd taken the risk to expose what was happening. Victoria's investigators located her in Queens. Single mother, 2 teenagers, working 3 jobs after Maplewood fired her for suspected whistleblowing. They couldn't prove she'd sent the documents, but they'd fired her anyway, blacklisted her in the industry, made sure she couldn't find work in healthcare again. Sarah insisted on going to see her. David came too. They found Linda's building in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, climbed 4 flights of stairs to an apartment that was clean but spare. Linda answered the door and recognized Sarah immediately. Her face crumpled. "I should have done it sooner." The words tumbled out before Sarah could speak. "Should have sent those documents years ago. Should have spoken up when they fired you." "I was scared of losing my job, scared of not being able to feed my kids. So I stayed quiet, and I hate myself for it." Sarah stepped forward, took Linda's hands. "You did it. That's what matters. You found the courage. You took the risk. You're the reason we can fight back." Linda let them in. The apartment was tiny, 2 bedrooms for 3 people, furniture that had been repaired too many times. But there were books everywhere. Homework spread across the kitchen table. Photos on the walls of 2 teenagers in school uniforms, smiling. This was a home built on sacrifice and held together by love. "They fired you." Sarah made it a statement, not a question. Linda nodded. 3 days after I mailed those documents. Said they were restructuring, that my position was eliminated. But I know why. They must have suspected. They can't prove it, but they know. "How are you managing?" "Barely." Linda's laugh was bitter. "I'm working as a home health aide off the books, cleaning houses, walking dogs, whatever I can find. The blacklist is real. No nursing home will hire me. No hospital. I'm shut out of the only work I know how to do." David spoke for the first time. "We want to add a wrongful termination claim to the lawsuit. For you and for Sarah. They can't retaliate against whistleblowers, can't fire people for reporting abuse." Linda looked skeptical. You think they care about laws? They've been breaking laws for years and no one stopped them. They will now, David's voice was certain. Because you gave us the proof. Because you were brave enough to speak up. We're going to make sure everyone knows what you did. And we're going to make sure you're compensated for what it cost you. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Why? You don't even know me. Because it's right. Sarah squeezed her hand. Because you showed up when it mattered. Because you did what no one else was willing to do. That deserves to be honored. Linda agreed to testify, to tell the court about finding the documents, about the culture of silence at Maplewood, about the ways staff were pressured to keep families away, about her own firing and blacklisting. She was terrified, but she was ready. As they left, Linda called after them, "Mrs. Hayes, how is she?" Sarah turned back. "She's fighting. She's strong. She sends her thanks. Tell her I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't do more sooner. Sorry I let fear win for so long. She understands fear." Sarah's voice was gentle. "We all do. But you beat it in the end. That's what matters." The weeks blurred together. Depositions and interviews and endless documentation. Sarah spent hours with Victoria's team, reconstructing her time at Maplewood. Every patient she remembered. Every policy that seemed wrong. Every moment of lucidity Margaret had that should have prompted a diagnosis review. The memories were painful. Brought back the smell of institutional cleaner and the sound of call buttons going unanswered, and the weight of caring for people the system had abandoned. But it also brought back good memories. The way Mr. Rodriguez would describe recipes in perfect detail, the sound of Mrs. Chen's opera singing, the feeling of Margaret's hand squeezing hers during a panic attack, the small moments of connection that made the hard work bearable. Those moments mattered. Sarah held on to them like proof that the world wasn't entirely broken. Margaret prepared for what was coming. She knew she'd have to testify, have to stand up in court and tell her story to strangers, have to relive the worst years of her life while lawyers tried to discredit her. She prepared with the same determination she'd brought to raising David alone, to working 3 jobs, to surviving 4 years of fog. This was just another hard thing that needed doing, so she'd do it. One evening, Sarah found her sitting alone on the balcony, looking out at the city. Margaret's face was thoughtful, distant. Sarah sat beside her quietly. "I'm scared." Margaret said it without preamble, not of testifying, not of facing them, but of forgetting again, of the fog coming back, of losing this clarity. Sarah took her hand. "The doctors say you're stable. The medication is working. You're not going back to that fog. But what if I do? What if stress triggers something? What if I stand up in that courtroom and suddenly I can't remember, can't find the words? Then David and I will be there. We'll help you. We'll speak for you if we need to. You're not alone in this." Margaret looked at her. Really looked. "You've become so important to us. To me. I don't think you understand how much. You're not just someone who helped me. You're family now." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. "You're family to me too. You and David. You've given me something I thought I'd lost. A reason to care, a place to belong." They sat together in the cooling evening air. 2 women who'd been brought together by cruelty and who'd found in each other something that looked like salvation. The city sprawled below them, full of people fighting their own battles, carrying their own griefs. But for this moment, on this balcony, they had each other. And that was enough. The relationship with David deepened gradually. Nothing dramatic, no grand romantic gestures. Just the slow accumulation of shared moments that built something solid. Making breakfast together in the morning, working side by side on case documents in the evening, falling asleep on the couch during late-night research sessions. Small intimacies that felt more significant than grand declarations. They kissed sometimes, held hands often, but mostly they just existed together, learning each other's rhythms, learning how to be present without pressure, learning that love, if that's what this was becoming, didn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it was just showing up, being there, choosing each other again and again in small, quiet ways. One night, 3 months into living together, Sarah woke from a nightmare, dreamed she was back at Maplewood, watching Margaret slip into fog, unable to stop it. She sat up gasping, disoriented in the darkness. A light knock on her door. David's voice concerned. "You okay? I heard you cry out." Sarah opened the door, found him in pajama pants and a t-shirt, hair disheveled, worry clear on his face. "Just a bad dream." "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, and he could see it. "Come here." He opened his arms. No expectations, just comfort. Sarah stepped into the embrace. Let herself be held. Let herself acknowledge that she was scared too. Scared of losing Margaret again. Scared of this lawsuit failing. Scared of letting these people down. Scared of getting too attached to something that might not last. David held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out. Then he stepped back, hands on her shoulders, looking at her with those gray eyes that saw too much. "We're going to be okay. All of us, we're going to get through this together." "How can you be sure?" "Because we're showing up. That's all we can do. Show up and try. The outcome isn't in our control, but the effort is." Sarah nodded. Let him walk her back to bed. Let him tuck the blankets around her like she was something precious that needed protecting. Watched him leave, closing the door softly behind him, and thought about how strange this was, how unexpected. This life she was building with these people in this apartment while they fought this fight. It wasn't what she'd imagined, but it was real, and it mattered, and that was more than she'd had in years. 4 months into the investigation, Health Corp made their move, offered a settlement, $8 million, no admission of guilt, strict confidentiality agreements. Take the money and go away quietly. Let them fix the problems internally without public scrutiny. It was a significant offer, life-changing money for everyone involved, enough to retire Margaret comfortably, enough to pay off Sarah's student loans 10 times over, enough to compensate the other families for their losses. But it came with silence, with letting Health Corp continue operating, with no guarantee the same thing wouldn't happen to someone else. Victoria presented the offer in her conference room. The families gathered to discuss it. Arguments went both ways. Some wanted the money, wanted closure, wanted to move on with their lives without the stress of a trial. Others wanted justice, wanted Health Corp exposed, wanted to make sure no one else went through what they'd gone through. Margaret listened to all of it. Then she spoke. "I'm 73 years old. I've lost 4 years I can never get back. I've lost time with my son I can never reclaim. I've lost Sarah, my dear friend, for 19 months. I've lost the chance to know my own mind during years when I should have been living fully. That's what this settlement represents. An acknowledgement that I was wronged. But it's not enough." She paused, looking around the room at all the families gathered there. "Because I'm not the only one. 23 people like me, 6 who died, hundreds more who might be in similar situations right now in Health Corp facilities. Thousands who will trust these places in the future. If we take this money and stay silent, we're saying their profit matters more than those lives. We're saying justice has a price, and $8 million is enough." Another pause. Her voice got stronger. "I say it's not enough. I say we fight. We take them to court. We make them answer for what they've done. We force them to change. Not quietly, not internally, but publicly, transparently, with oversight and accountability and consequences. That's worth more than any amount of money." The room was silent. Then Patricia Morrison, the teacher whose mother died alone, spoke up. "I agree. I want them to pay. Not just with money. With their reputations, with their positions, with real consequences that prevent this from happening again. My mother deserves that. We all deserve that." One by one, the families agreed. They'd fight. They'd refuse the settlement. They'd take this to trial, no matter how long it took or how hard it got. Because some things mattered more than money. Some things required standing up and saying no. This far and no further. Health Corp's lawyers were furious, threatened years of litigation, promised to drag every family through depositions and examinations, warned that trials were unpredictable, that they might lose everything. But the families held firm. With Margaret as their anchor, they stayed united. The trial date was set. 8 months away, 8 months to prepare, 8 months for Health Corp to throw everything they had at breaking the family's resolve. 8 months of pressure and stress, and the constant weight of knowing they were fighting something bigger and more powerful than themselves. But they had something Health Corp didn't. They had truth, They had documentation, they had Linda's courage and Margaret's strength, and the combined grief of 23 families who refused to be silent anymore. And they had each other. Sarah watched it all unfold with a mixture of awe and terror. This thing they'd started, this fight they'd chosen, it was so much bigger than she'd imagined. The implications reached far beyond Margaret, far beyond Maplewood. This was about elder care in America, about profit motives in healthcare, about the value society placed on its most vulnerable members, about whether corporations could buy their way out of accountability, or whether justice still meant something. The weight of it was crushing sometimes. Sarah would lie awake at night thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the people depending on them to get this right, all the other facilities that might be doing the same things, watching to see if they could get away with it. The responsibility felt enormous, impossible. But then she'd get up in the morning, make breakfast with David, listen to Margaret talk about her plans for after the trial, the foundation she wanted to start, the advocacy work she wanted to do. And Sarah would remember why they were fighting, not just for justice in the abstract, but for Margaret, for Linda, for the 6 people who died, for every person sitting in a care facility right now wondering why their family doesn't visit, for everyone who might need care in the future. That made it bearable. That made it worth it. One evening, 6 months before the trial, Sarah found David on the balcony. He was holding his phone, staring at it with an expression she couldn't read. She almost turned around, gave him privacy, but something in his posture made her stay. "Everything okay?" He looked up, his eyes were wet. "I found something. In the emails Linda sent. One I didn't see the first time. Hidden in a thread I'd stopped reading because it was too painful." "What was it?" "It was from my mother. Somehow she'd gotten access to a computer. Must have been during a lucid moment. She'd sent me an email 14 months ago. Before they tightened security. Before they took away every possible way for her to contact me." He handed Sarah the phone. She read the email. Brief, desperate, perfectly lucid. "David, if you're reading this, please know I'm still here. I'm still me. They tell you I'm gone, but I'm not. I have moments when I'm clear, when I remember everything. I miss you so much. I don't understand why you won't visit. Please, son, please come. Even if they say I won't know you, try. Please try. I love you. Mom." Below it, an automated response. "This email address is not monitored. For information about residents, please contact administration." Sarah felt her heart break. For David, for Margaret, for the misconnection that could have changed everything. She did try. She reached out, and no one told me. David's voice was raw. "This email went to some automated system, and no one ever flagged it for human review. She reached out, and her message disappeared into a void. Another thing they took from us." Sarah didn't have words. Sometimes there aren't any. She just put her arms around him and held on while he cried. For his mother, for himself, for the 14 months between that email and the day Diane Chen called to tell him the truth. 14 months when things could have been different, when the fog could have lifted sooner, when he could have been there. After a while, David pulled himself together, wiped his eyes, looked at Sarah with something like determination hardening his grief. "We're going to win this. We're going to make them pay for every single thing they took from us. Every email, every visit, every moment. All of it." "Yes!" Sarah's voice was fierce. "We are!" They stood together on the balcony as evening fell. The city lights came on one by one, each one representing a life, a story, a struggle. Somewhere out there were other families being lied to, other patients being kept in fog, other people fighting systems that didn't value them. But here, in this moment, 2 people stood together and promised not to give up, not to back down, not to let the hard parts break them. Inside, Margaret was reading, safe, clear, loved. That's what they were fighting for. That and the knowledge that no one else should have to fight this hard just to be with the people they loved. That care shouldn't come with a price tag that included isolation. That profit should never matter more than people. The trial was coming. The real fight. Everything they'd worked for would come down to a courtroom and a jury, and the question of whether truth and documentation could overcome corporate lawyers and unlimited resources. It was terrifying, but they were ready, or as ready as anyone could be to fight something so much bigger than themselves. As ready as 3 people and 23 families could be to take on a healthcare corporation and demand accountability. As ready as imperfect humans ever are to stand up and say, "This matters. This fight matters. These lives matter. And we will not be silent." Sarah thought about her mother, about the hospice nurses who'd shown up for them, about the promise she'd made to take care of people, to be present, to matter. She'd tried to honor that promise and been fired for it, been punished for caring, been taught that showing up came with costs most people weren't willing to pay. But here she was, still showing up, still fighting, still choosing to matter even when it was hard. Maybe that's what courage was, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, to keep showing up even when showing up hurt, to keep fighting even when the fight seemed impossible. Margaret always said everyone deserves to be remembered. Everyone deserves to have someone who shows up. Sarah was learning that was true, but she was also learning something else, that the people who show up deserve to be honored, deserve to be protected, deserve to have others show up for them when the weight gets too heavy to carry alone. They had each other. That was something. Maybe that was everything. 3 imperfect people who'd been brought together by cruelty and who decided to transform that cruelty into something that looked like justice. It wasn't a perfect story. There were no guarantees of success, but it was real. And they were trying, and sometimes trying was enough. The evening deepened into night. David and Sarah eventually went inside, found Margaret still awake, waiting for them. She looked at their faces and understood without asking that something significant had shifted. She held out her hands. They came to her, sat on either side of her chair. Let her hold them the way a mother holds children who've been hurt. Let her offer the comfort they all needed. Let her be strong for them the way they'd been strong for her. Tomorrow would bring more work, more preparation, more stress. But tonight, they had this moment, this connection, this strange family built from loss and held together by the decision to keep showing up for each other, no matter what it cost. And for now, that was enough. The months before trial passed in a blur of preparation that felt both endless and too fast. Sarah learned that justice was built not in dramatic moments, but in the tedious accumulation of documented evidence, depositions that stretched for days, medical records analyzed line by line, financial statements traced through labyrinthine corporate structures. Every claim had to be proven, every assertion backed by documentation, every emotion translated into legal language that could survive cross-examination. Victoria's team grew. 6 attorneys became 8, then 10. Paralegals worked around the clock organizing documents. Expert witnesses were retained, neurologists to testify about Margaret's condition, healthcare administrators to explain standard of care, financial analysts to trace the money. Each one cost thousands of dollars. The legal fees mounted steadily, approaching the $1 million mark. David paid without hesitation, but Sarah watched the numbers climb with quiet anxiety. So much money. So much riding on an outcome they couldn't control. Sarah's deposition took place over 2 days in a conference room that smelled like fear and expensive coffee. Health Corp's attorneys were aggressive. 3 of them, all men, all wearing suits that cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. They questioned every detail of her memory, every conversation with Margaret, every moment of lucidity she claimed to have witnessed. They suggested she was biased, emotionally involved, that her judgment was clouded by personal attachment, that she couldn't be trusted to accurately recall events from 3 years ago. Victoria coached her through it. Stay calm. Answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information. Don't let them make you angry. But it was hard, sitting across from lawyers who implied she was lying, who suggested Margaret's lucid moments were wishful thinking, who hinted that Sarah had fabricated her relationship with Margaret to insert herself into a lawsuit for financial gain. After 10 hours spread across 2 days, Sarah emerged exhausted and shaken. David met her outside the building. took one look at her face and pulled her into his arms without asking. She let herself lean into him, let herself acknowledge how brutal it had been. They tried to break me. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. Tried to make me doubt what I saw, what I remember. Did they succeed? Sarah pulled back, met his eyes. No, because I know what I saw. I know what Margaret was like. I know the difference between dementia and sedation. They can question my memory all they want. It doesn't change the truth. Good. David's voice was fierce. Because you're going to have to do it again at trial, in front of a jury. With Margaret watching, it's going to be even harder. I know. Sarah straightened her shoulders. I'm ready. But ready felt like an insufficient word for what was coming. Linda's deposition was worse. She sat across from the same lawyers, and they went after her credibility with surgical precision. They brought up her financial struggles, suggested she'd sent the documents hoping for a payout. They questioned why she'd waited so long to speak up, implied that if the abuse was real, a truly moral person would have reported it immediately. They painted her as an opportunist, a woman who'd participated in the system for years and only objected when she got fired. Linda held up under the questioning, but barely. Sarah watched through the glass wall of the conference room, saw Linda's hands shaking, saw the tears she was fighting to keep back. When it was over, Linda stumbled out looking destroyed. I'm sorry. She said it over and over. I'm so sorry. I should have been stronger. Should have done this years ago. I let them make me doubt myself. Sarah took her hands. You survived. You told the truth. That's all anyone can ask. But Linda couldn't be comforted. The deposition had reopened every wound, every moment of moral compromise she'd made to keep her job and feed her kids. The guilt was crushing her. Sarah recognized it, knew that particular weight intimately. The guilt of surviving when others didn't, of staying silent when you should have spoken, of choosing yourself over doing the right thing. That guilt didn't wash away with truth-telling. It just became something you learned to carry. They needed more. Victoria was clear about that. We have documentation, we have testimony, but we need someone from inside. Someone who was there when decisions were made. Someone who can testify to the corporate culture, to the pressure administrators were under to maximize revenue. That someone turned out to be Diane Chen, the new director who'd taken over Maplewood, who'd found the documents, who'd called David to tell him about Margaret's misdiagnosis. She agreed to testify, but it cost her. Health Corp fired her within a week of her deposition, eliminated her position, offered a severance package contingent on her signing a non-disclosure agreement. She refused to sign, walked away from the money, added her own wrongful termination claim to the growing lawsuit. Sarah met her for coffee a month before trial. Diane was 52, composed, had worked in elder care for 30 years. She'd taken the Maplewood job specifically because she'd heard rumors about the place, wanted to see if she could change things from inside. Instead, she'd found a system so corrupt that changing it from within was impossible. I thought I could make a difference. Diane stirred her coffee mechanically. Thought if I documented everything, followed every proper channel, I could fix it. But Health Corp doesn't want it fixed. The system is working exactly as they designed it. Maximum billing, minimum care. Families kept at distance. Any staff member who objects gets eliminated. She looked at Sarah directly. You were eliminated because you were good at your job, because you actually cared. That made you dangerous. Same reason they eliminated Linda. Same reason they eliminated me. We saw too much, cared too much, questioned too much. That's not acceptable in a system built on not seeing. The conversation stayed with Sarah. She'd always known she was fired for caring, but hearing it from someone who'd spent 3 decades in the system gave it different weight. It wasn't personal. It was structural. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was designed, built into every policy, every procedure, every metric that measured success in dollars rather than human dignity. Dr. Richard Thornton's role became clearer as the investigation continued. He hadn't started out evil. That's what made his story more tragic than villainous. He'd graduated medical school with debt, started at Maplewood with genuine intentions to help people. But Health Corp's compensation structure was designed to corrupt, bonuses tied to billing, promotions tied to revenue. The message was clear. make money or get replaced. The investigators found the gambling debts, $400,000 to various casinos. Thornton had a problem. Health Corp executives found out. Instead of firing him, they used it, gave him a choice. Play ball or we expose you. Ruin your medical license. End your career. He chose to play ball. Started adjusting diagnoses to justify longer stays. Started blocking family visits to prevent interference. Started prescribing medications that kept patients compliant rather than help them heal. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil. Thornton was a man who'd made terrible choices under pressure, who'd lacked the courage to sacrifice himself for his principles, who'd told himself he was trapped when really he was just scared. Thousands of small compromises that added up to something monstrous. Victoria wanted to paint him as the villain, simple, clear, but Sarah found herself thinking about the distance between who you want to be and who circumstances force you to become, about the ways systems break people, about how easy it is to judge someone else's moral failings when you're not the one facing the consequences of doing right. Still, people died. Margaret lost 4 years. Families were lied to. Whatever pressure Thornton faced, he'd chosen to inflict harm rather than accept consequences. That choice had to mean something, had to carry weight. Otherwise, what was the point of any of this? The media discovered the story 3 months before trial. A reporter from the New York Times got wind of the lawsuit, published a piece that went viral. Healthcare corporation accused of sedating elderly patients for profit. The response was explosive. Other families came forward, people who'd had loved ones at Health Corp facilities, who'd been told not to visit, who'd watched their parents decline faster than expected, who'd suspected something was wrong but had no proof. No way to fight back. The story grew, became national news. Congressional hearings were announced. Federal investigators opened inquiries. Health Corp's stock price tumbled. Executives resigned. The corporation issued statements about being shocked by the allegations, about launching internal investigations, about their commitment to quality care. All the predictable corporate responses designed to deflect blame while admitting nothing. Margaret did one interview. 60 Minutes sent a crew to David's apartment. The interviewer was respectful, careful. Asked Margaret about the fog, about being kept from David, about Sarah being fired. Margaret answered every question with quiet dignity. No rage, no histrionics, just clear, precise descriptions of what had been done to her. The moment that went viral was near the end. The interviewer asked if Margaret was angry. Margaret paused for a long moment before answering. Anger is easy. It burns hot and fast, and then it's gone. What I feel is more like determination. I want Health Corp held accountable. But more than that, I want every person watching this to know that if your loved one is in a facility and something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Ask questions. Demand answers. Show up even when they tell you not to, because the people running these places are counting on you being too polite, too trusting, too intimidated to fight back. Don't be. She looked directly into the camera. Everyone deserves to be remembered. Everyone deserves to have someone who shows up. If you have someone in care, be that person. Show up. It might save their life. The clip was shared millions of times. Margaret's face became the face of elder care reform. Advocacy groups contacted Victoria, requested permission to file amicus briefs, offered support. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one family in one nursing home. It was about an entire system that valued profit over people, about the way America treated its elderly, about dignity and care and the basic human right to be seen. The weight of it was crushing. Sarah felt it every day. The knowledge that so many people were watching, that the outcome of this trial would ripple far beyond Margaret and David and the 23 families they represented, that they had become symbols of something bigger than themselves. It was terrifying and humbling and exhausting. 2 weeks before trial, Margaret's fear manifested. She woke from a nightmare screaming. Sarah reached her first, found her disoriented and panicking in the darkness, took Margaret's hands, spoke quietly. You're safe. You're home. You're with David and me. You're not back there. You're here. You're clear. You're safe. But Margaret couldn't calm down. Her breathing came in gasps. Her eyes were wild. I was back in the fog. I couldn't find my way out. I kept calling for you and you couldn't hear me. I was drowning and no one would help. It took 30 minutes to bring her back fully. David made tea. Sarah held her. They sat together in the living room with all the lights on, waiting for the panic to subside. When Margaret finally spoke again, her voice was small, smaller than Sarah had ever heard it. What if it happens at trial? What if I stand up to testify and the stress brings back the fog? What if I can't remember what I need to say? What if I make us lose? Sarah met David's eyes, saw the same fear reflected there, the fear that the trauma of testifying would be too much, that Margaret would break under cross-examination, that Health Corp's lawyers would exploit her vulnerability and use it to discredit everything they'd worked for. It was a real possibility. They all knew it. But Sarah kept her voice steady. Then we'll adapt. If you can't testify, we'll find another way. We have documents. We have other witnesses. We have truth on our side. You don't have to carry this alone. David moved to sit on Margaret's other side. Mom, you've already won. You survived. You got your clarity back. You're fighting for change. That's already more than they expected from you. If standing up in that courtroom is too much, no one will judge you for it. Margaret shook her head. No, I need to do this. I need to tell my story, for me, for the 6 people who died, for everyone still trapped in places like Maplewood. She took a shaky breath. I'm just scared. Being scared is okay. Sarah squeezed her hand. It means you understand what's at stake. It means you're human. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the thing anyway. Margaret nodded slowly, then helped me be brave, both of you. When the day comes, help me be brave enough to speak. They promised. Sat with her until dawn, made breakfast together as the sun rose, moved through the morning routines that had become familiar over these months of living together. Small acts of normalcy that grounded them, that reminded them they were more than this fight. They were a family, imperfect and chosen, and held together by something stronger than blood. The week before trial, Victoria called a final meeting. All the families gathered in her conference room. 23 patients, 28 family members who'd be in the courtroom. Linda, Diane, various expert witnesses. The room was packed. Victoria stood at the head of the table with the kind of focused intensity that came from 3 decades of fighting battles like this. This is it. Her voice cut through the nervous chatter. Next week, we walk into that courtroom and we tell the truth. Health Corp will try to paint us as opportunists, as money grabbers, as people exploiting tragedy for personal gain. They'll attack our credibility, our memories, our motives. It's going to be brutal. Some of you won't make it through your testimony without breaking down. That's okay. The jury needs to see what this cost you, what it's still costing you. She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. But here's what I need you to remember. We have something they don't. We have truth, we have documentation. We have a paper trail that proves every allegation we're making. They can attack our emotions. They can question our motives. But they can't change the facts. And the facts are damning. Another pause. Victoria's voice got softer. I've been doing this for 26 years. I've seen cases that should have been slam dunks fall apart. I've seen guilty parties walk away. I've seen families destroyed by the process of seeking justice. So I won't promise you will win. I won't promise this will be easy. What I will promise is that we'll fight. We'll fight with everything we have. And regardless of the outcome, you'll know you stood up. You showed up, you said this matters, that has value beyond any verdict. The families murmured agreement. Sarah felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders. All these people, all this pain, all this hope concentrated into 12 strangers in a jury box who would decide if any of it mattered. It was too much, too fragile, too dependent on variables they couldn't control. But it was what they had, so it would have to be enough. The first day of trial arrived like an execution date. Sarah dressed carefully. Conservative clothes, minimal makeup, nothing that could be used to paint her as anything other than a working-class woman who'd cared about her patients. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone older than 26. Someone who'd been aged by grief and responsibility and the weight of fighting something so much bigger than herself. David knocked on her door. Ready? As I'll ever be. They collected Margaret from her room. She was pale but composed, wearing a blue dress that made her eyes look brighter, hair carefully styled, every inch the dignified woman who'd raised a son alone and survived 4 years of abuse and refused to be broken by any of it. She looked at both of them. Thank you for standing with me, for making this possible. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that having you both beside me matters more than any verdict. Sarah felt tears threaten, pushed them back. Time for tears later. Right now they needed to be strong. They needed to walk into that courtroom with heads high and show Health Corp that they weren't backing down, that they weren't scared, even though they were absolutely terrified. The courthouse was chaos, media everywhere, cameras, reporters shouting questions, protesters with signs supporting both sides. Elderly rights advocates on one side, healthcare industry representatives on the other, police keeping everyone back. Victoria's team navigated them through the crowd and into the building, through security, up elevators, down hallways that smelled like old wood and older justice. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah expected, more intimate. Wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting in judgment of each other, high ceilings that made voices echo, windows that let in morning light that felt too cheerful for what was about to happen. The jury box empty, the judge's bench imposing, everything designed to intimidate, to make you feel small. Health Corp's legal team was already seated, 12 attorneys, all expensive suits and confident expressions. Behind them sat executives in even more expensive suits. Men in their 50s and 60s who'd made millions running a corporation that treated human lives as revenue streams. They didn't look evil. That was the thing. They looked like anyone's grandfather, pleasant, professional, completely disconnected from the harm they'd enabled. Dr. Thornton sat at the defense table. 54 years old, gray hair, kind eyes. He looked like someone you'd trust with your health, with your mother's care. There was no visible marker of the choices he'd made, no sign that he deliberately kept people sedated for profit. He just looked like a tired doctor at the end of a long career. Sarah found that more disturbing than if he'd looked like a monster. The families filed in, took seats behind Victoria's table. Sarah sat between David and Margaret, felt their presence on either side like anchors. Linda sat directly behind her, leaned forward to whisper, "We're doing this. We're really doing this." Sarah reached back, squeezed her hand. "We're doing this." The bailiff called for everyone to rise. The judge entered, the Honorable Catherine Walsh, 60 years old, 20 years on the bench. Reputation for being fair but no nonsense. She looked over the packed courtroom with an expression that suggested she knew exactly how significant this case was, how much was riding on her ability to keep it fair. She seated everyone, called the case, Manhattan Supreme Court, Hayes versus Health Corp. The words echoed in the silence, made it real in a way nothing else had. This was happening after months of preparation, after years of abuse, after 4 years of Margaret lost in fog. This was finally happening. The jury filed in. 12 people, 5 women, 7 men, range of ages and races. Ordinary people who'd been selected to decide something extraordinary. They looked nervous, curious, completely unaware of how much their decision would matter to the people sitting in this courtroom, to the thousands of people watching from home, to every family with a loved one in elder care who was wondering if they could trust the system. Victoria stood for opening arguments, took a moment to look at each juror, making connection, making them see her as human rather than just a lawyer. Then she began. Her voice was clear, steady. She laid out the case methodically, explained what normal pressure hydrocephalus was, how it differed from dementia, how it was treatable, how Margaret had been misdiagnosed and kept sedated despite evidence that her condition was improving, how David had been systematically blocked from visiting his mother, how Sarah had been fired for noticing Margaret's lucid episodes, how 23 families had been betrayed, how 6 people had died. She explained the money, the $17,500 per month Margaret's care cost, multiplied by 48 months. $840,000. She showed the billing records, the medication schedules, the memos discussing revenue optimization, the emails blocking family contact. She built the case piece by piece, made it impossible to miss the pattern, made the conspiracy undeniable. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. The jury looked shaken. Several were taking notes. One older woman had tears in her eyes. Victoria had done her job, planted the seed of outrage, made them care, made them want justice. Health Corp's lead attorney stood. His name was Marcus Bradford, 30 years of defending corporations. Reputation for being ruthless but effective. He approached the jury with a different energy, calm, reasonable, slightly regretful that everyone was here. His opening was designed to make them doubt. He talked about the complexity of medical diagnosis, about how doctors make judgment calls with incomplete information, about how families often see improvement where none exists because they want so desperately to believe their loved one is getting better. He suggested that Margaret's lucid episodes were actually confabulation, a common symptom of dementia where patients appear aware but are actually just responding to external cues without true understanding. He admitted there were communication issues, said Health Corp took full responsibility for not keeping families adequately informed, but he characterized it as bureaucratic failure rather than deliberate conspiracy, painted the staff as overworked and underfunded rather than malicious, suggested that hindsight made everything look more sinister than it was in the moment. He was good. Sarah could feel the jury wavering, could see doubt creeping into their expressions. That's what scared her most. Not that Health Corp would deny the facts, but that they'd acknowledge mistakes while denying intent, that they'd position themselves as imperfect but well-meaning, that they'd make the jury believe that what happened to Margaret was tragic but not criminal, regrettable but not actionable. By the time Bradford sat down, the jury looked confused, uncertain, exactly what he wanted. If they were uncertain, they couldn't convict, couldn't award damages, couldn't hold anyone accountable. Uncertainty was Health Corp's friend. The first witness was Diane Chen. She walked to the stand with quiet dignity, was sworn in, took her seat. Victoria established her credentials: 30 years in elder care, spotless record, multiple awards for excellence. Then got to the relevant testimony. What did you observe when you took over as director of Maplewood Manor? Diane's voice was steady. I observed systematic issues with patient care, medication protocols that prioritize compliance over treatment, communication policies that discouraged family involvement, staff who were afraid to question medical decisions, a culture that valued revenue over patient outcomes. Did you find documentation of these issues? Yes. In the previous administrator's locked desk, memos discussing how to maximize billing, notes about keeping families at distance, medical records with notations suggesting diagnoses were being maintained for financial rather than clinical reasons. And what did you do with this information? I contacted Mr. Hayes, told him his mother had been misdiagnosed, started treatment immediately. Then I was fired. The cross-examination was brutal. Bradford implied Diane had an axe to grind, that she'd been fired for poor performance, and was now fabricating a conspiracy to explain her termination. He questioned her interpretation of the documents, suggested she'd misunderstood medical notations, made it sound like she was a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. But Diane held firm, answered every question calmly, refused to be rattled. By the time she stepped down, the jury looked troubled again, uncertain who to believe. Exactly what Health Corp wanted. Sarah testified on day 2. She'd been dreading this moment for months, walked to the stand feeling like she might vomit, was sworn in, sat in the chair that put her facing the entire courtroom, all those faces watching, judging, deciding if she was credible, if her memories mattered, if she deserved to be believed. Victoria took her through the timeline gently, how long she'd worked at Maplewood, how she'd met Margaret, the relationship they'd built, the lucid episodes she'd witnessed, the conversations they'd had. Sarah described it all in as much detail as she could remember, tried to make the jury see Margaret as she'd been, sharp, funny, completely present during those clear moments, not confabulating, not confused, actually there. Then came the hard part, describing the day she was fired, the administrator's words, too emotionally invested, boundary issues, being escorted out without being allowed to say goodbye, the months of trying to reach Margaret and being blocked, the guilt of thinking Margaret believed she'd abandoned her. Sarah's voice cracked, describing that guilt. She couldn't help it. The memory was too raw, too painful. She saw several jury members lean forward, saw compassion on their faces. But she also saw skepticism, the inevitable question. If she'd cared so much, why hadn't she fought harder? Why hadn't she found a way? Bradford's cross-examination exploited that skepticism. He questioned why Sarah hadn't reported her concerns to authorities if she truly believed patients were being mistreated, why she'd accepted her firing without legal challenge, why she'd moved on to another job instead of continuing to fight. He made it sound like she hadn't actually cared that much, that this lawsuit was about money, not justice, that she was opportunistic rather than principled. Sarah felt herself getting defensive, getting angry. Victoria had warned her about this. Stay calm. Don't let them make you emotional. But it was hard, sitting there while this man in his expensive suit suggested she'd invented her relationship with Margaret for profit, that her grief wasn't real, that her love didn't matter. The only thing that got her through was looking at Margaret, seeing her sitting in the gallery with tears streaming down her face, seeing her mouth the words "thank you," seeing her bear witness to Sarah's truth even as lawyers tried to tear it apart. That made it bearable, made it worth it. Linda testified on day 3. She was visibly terrified, voice shaking, hands trembling, but she told her story about finding the documents, about sending them to Sarah, about being fired, about being blacklisted, about the cost of speaking truth to power when you're a single mother with no safety net. Bradford tried to paint her as vengeful, suggested she'd stolen the documents to get revenge for being fired, implied she was lying about the timeline, made her admit she'd participated in the system for years before objecting, used her silence against her, made it sound like complicity rather than fear. But Linda held on, barely. When she stepped down, she was crying openly. Sarah met her in the hallway during recess, held her while she sobbed. I failed. I let them make me sound like a liar. You told the truth. That's all you could do. That's all any of us can do. But Linda couldn't be comforted. The experience had broken something in her, confirmed her worst fears about herself, that she was weak, that she'd waited too long, that her courage, when it finally came, wasn't enough to matter. Sarah knew that feeling, carried her own version of it, the fear that showing up wasn't enough, that trying wasn't enough, that even when you did everything you could, it still wouldn't be enough to make things right. The trial continued. Medical experts testified. Financial analysts explained the billing schemes. Other family members told their stories. Each day brought new testimony, new evidence, new moments of hope and despair. The jury listened, took notes, gave nothing away. 12 strangers holding all their futures in hands that showed no sign of which way they were leaning. And through it all, Margaret sat in the gallery, watching, waiting, preparing for the day when she'd have to take the stand, when she'd have to look at the people who'd stolen 4 years of her life and tell them exactly what they'd taken, when she'd have to be brave enough to speak truth in a room designed to make truth feel uncertain. That day was coming. Sarah could feel it approaching like a storm, could see Margaret steeling herself for it, could sense the weight of everything they'd worked for narrowing down to one moment, one testimony, one woman standing up and saying, "This happened to me and it mattered and I will not be silenced." The question was whether it would be enough, whether 12 strangers would hear her and believe, whether truth and documentation and righteous anger would be enough to overcome corporate lawyers and reasonable doubt, and a system designed to protect institutions over individuals. Sarah didn't know. Nobody did. That was the terrifying part. They'd done everything right, gathered evidence, built a case, told their truth, and it still might not be enough. Justice was never guaranteed. Sometimes the bad guys won, sometimes the system protected the powerful, sometimes showing up and speaking truth and fighting the good fight still ended in loss. But they were trying anyway. That had to count for something, had to mean something. Even if they lost, they'd stood up. They'd said this matters. They'd refused to be silent. Maybe that was its own kind of victory. Maybe showing up was enough regardless of outcome. Or maybe Sarah was just trying to prepare herself for the possibility of failure, for the weight of letting Margaret down, for the knowledge that all this pain and effort and exposure might lead nowhere, that Health Corp might walk away, that Dr. Thornton might keep his license, that nothing would change. She couldn't think about that. Not now, not with days of testimony still ahead, not with Margaret's moment approaching. She had to believe it would matter, had to trust that truth still had power, had to hold on to hope even when hope felt naive. Because what was the alternative? Give up, walk away, accept that some fights can't be won, that some wrongs can't be righted, that some people don't matter enough for the system to care? No, Sarah rejected that completely. They'd come too far, sacrificed too much. Margaret deserved better. They all did. Every person who'd been betrayed by a system that valued profit over people deserved to have someone fight for them, deserved to have someone show up and say, "This is wrong and it ends here." That's what they were doing. Win or lose. That's what this trial represented. People showing up, people refusing to be silent. People saying that dignity and care and human life mattered more than corporate profits and quarterly reports and shareholder value. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the fight itself was the point. Maybe showing up was always enough regardless of outcome. Maybe that's what courage was. Not winning, just refusing to stop trying. Sarah held on to that thought as day 3 ended, and they walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun. Held on to it as they went home to David's apartment that had become all of their home. Held on to it as they made dinner together and tried to act normal and prepared for the next day and the day after that, and the day when Margaret would finally take the stand. They'd come this far together. They'd see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. Because that's what showing up meant. Not just being there for the easy parts, but staying through the hard parts too. The scary parts, the uncertain parts, the parts where you didn't know if your presence would make any difference, but you showed up anyway, because that's what you owed each other. And so they would. They'd show up. For Margaret, for each other, for everyone watching, for the 6 people who died, for the thousands of people still trapped in facilities that valued profit over people. They'd show up and speak truth and let the chips fall where they may, because in the end, that was all they could control. Not the outcome, not the verdict, not whether 12 strangers would believe them, just the choice to be present, to be brave, to keep showing up even when showing up hurt. And that, Sarah was learning, was the hardest kind of courage, the kind that kept going even when success wasn't guaranteed, the kind that showed up anyway, the kind that mattered most precisely because it cost the most, the kind that Margaret had shown her, the kind that David was learning, the kind that Linda had finally found, the kind that bound them all together in this fight that was bigger than any of them, but somehow felt exactly the right size when they faced it together. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more cross-examination, more moments of hope and despair. But tonight they had each other, had this chosen family built from shared trauma and growing love, had the knowledge that regardless of outcome, they'd tried, they'd shown up, they'd fought, and sometimes, maybe, that was enough. Margaret took the stand on day 7 of the trial. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the back, press squeezed into every available space. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the woman at the center of it all, the face that had become synonymous with elder care reform, the person whose story had started everything. She walked to the witness stand without assistance, refused the wheelchair. Her steps were slow but steady, deliberate, each one a statement. I am not broken. I am not diminished. I am here. I am present. I matter. The bailiff swore her in. She placed her hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth. Her voice didn't waver. She sat in the chair that had held so many witnesses before her, looked out at the courtroom full of people watching, waiting, judging, and she did not look away. Victoria approached gently, established the basics first. Name, age, where she lived, how long she'd been at Maplewood Manor. Simple questions designed to ease Margaret into testimony, to let the jury see her as competent, clear, credible, not the confused old woman Health Corp would try to paint her as. Mrs. Hayes, can you describe what it felt like during the years you were at Maplewood? Margaret took a breath, gathered herself. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. Imagine drowning, but you're not in water, you're drowning in your own mind. I could see shapes moving above me, hear voices, muffled and distant, but I couldn't reach them, couldn't break through to the surface. Every time I'd fight toward consciousness, toward clarity, something would pull me back under. I know now it was medication, but then in the moment, it just felt like dying very slowly while everyone watched. Several jurors leaned forward. The older woman who'd cried during opening arguments had tears in her eyes again. Margaret continued. The worst part wasn't forgetting things, wasn't losing track of time or faces or words. The worst part was forgetting myself. I'd wake up and not know who I was, not remember my name, not understand where I was or why I was there. And then I'd have these moments, these brief moments of clarity where everything would snap into focus, where I'd remember I was Margaret Hayes, that I had a son named David who I loved more than life itself, that I'd raised him alone and worked 3 jobs and sacrificed everything to give him a future. Her voice caught. She paused, composed herself. The jury waited. No one moved. And in those clear moments, I'd ask for him. I'd beg the staff to call David, to tell him I was here, that I was lucid, that I needed him. They'd say he was busy, that he'd moved on with his life, that I should rest. And then they'd adjust my medication and I'd sink back under, back into the fog where I couldn't remember anything except the feeling of being abandoned, the knowledge that my son had forgotten me. Victoria let that sit for a moment, let the jury absorb it, then asked the next question. Were there staff members who treated you differently? Yes. Margaret's face softened. There was a young woman named Sarah Chen. She worked the overnight shift. She treated me like I was still a person, still someone worth knowing. She'd sit with me during the bad nights when I couldn't remember where I was, when panic would take over and I'd be so scared I couldn't breathe. She'd hold my hand, tell me I was safe, read to me from romance novels that made me laugh, talk to me like I mattered. And what happened to Sarah? Margaret's voice hardened. They fired her, told her she was too emotionally attached, that her boundary issues made other staff uncomfortable. The real reason was that she noticed I was getting better, that my lucid episodes were increasing, that something was wrong with my diagnosis. She asked questions, so they eliminated her, escorted her out of the building without letting her say goodbye to anyone. How did that make you feel? Margaret looked directly at the jury, like I'd lost the only person who cared if I lived or died. They told me she quit, that she found a better paying job and didn't want to work with old people anymore. And I believed them, because what else could I believe? I was forgetting everything else. Why wouldn't I forget how to make people want to stay? Victoria walked her through the rest, the months after Sarah left, the continued sedation, the blocked communications with David, the slow realization, once the fog lifted, of how completely she'd been betrayed, how 4 years had been stolen not through medical necessity, but through deliberate choice, how profit had mattered more than her life. By the time Victoria finished, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Several jurors were crying openly. The older woman had her hand over her mouth. Even the judge looked affected. Margaret had done what Sarah and Linda and Diane couldn't quite manage. She'd made the jury understand not just intellectually but viscerally what had been done to her, what it felt like to be trapped, to be voiceless, to be forgotten. Then came Bradford's cross-examination. He stood slowly, approached the witness stand with calculated caution. His strategy was clear. Handle her gently. Don't appear to be bullying an elderly woman, but undermine her credibility through questions that made her seem confused or unreliable. Mrs. Hayes, you testified that you had periods of lucidity while at Maplewood. How can you be certain those weren't what doctors call confabulation? A common symptom of dementia where patients appear aware, but are actually just responding to environmental cues without true understanding? Margaret looked at him directly. Because I remember conversations with Sarah in detail. I remember books we read together. I remember telling her about my life, about raising David, about working at Sal's Diner when David was young, about the $47 I gave him when he left for college. Those aren't environmental cues. Those are memories, my memories, and they're real. And Bradford tried a different angle. But you were on medication that can affect memory formation. How do you know these memories are accurate and not constructed after the fact? I know Because Sarah confirmed them. Margaret's voice was steel. When we found each other again, I told her things I remembered from our time together. She confirmed every detail, every conversation, every moment. My memories aren't constructed. They're real. I was there. I was present. And I remember everything they tried to take from me. He pressed harder. Isn't it true that you've struggled with memory issues since leaving Maplewood? That you've had episodes of confusion? Margaret didn't flinch. I had one nightmare, one panic attack triggered by stress. That's not the same as dementia. That's not the same as being chemically induced into fog. I'm clear now. I've been clear for months. My doctors confirm it. My medical records confirm it. The only people who seem invested in questioning my clarity are the ones who profited from taking it away. The jury shifted. Bradford had miscalculated. His attempt to discredit Margaret was making her more sympathetic, making Health Corp look worse. He tried to recover. You're seeking $47 million in this lawsuit. Isn't it possible that financial motivation is coloring your recollection of events? Margaret's voice went very quiet, very cold. You think I'm doing this for money? I'm 73 years old. I have everything I need. My son is successful. We live comfortably. What I don't have is 4 years of my life. 4 years with my son, 4 years of being myself. 4 years of dignity and choice and the basic human right to know my own mind. No amount of money can give me that back. This lawsuit isn't about compensation. It's about accountability. It's about making sure no one else loses what I lost. She paused, looked at the jury, then back at Bradford. And if you think I can be bought off from that mission, you understand nothing about who I am or what they took from me. Bradford had no response. He tried a few more questions, but they fell flat. The jury had made up their minds about Margaret. She was credible. She was clear. She was someone they believed. When Bradford finally sat down, defeat was visible in his posture. Health Corp's best hope had been to make Margaret seem unreliable, confused, motivated by greed. They'd failed completely. Victoria had no redirect. Margaret's testimony stood on its own. She stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to her seat in the gallery. David and Sarah stood as she approached. She sat between them, took both their hands, and together they waited for the rest of the trial to unfold. The defense put on their case, medical experts who testified about the difficulty of diagnosing neurological conditions, healthcare administrators who talked about the complexity of running care facilities, Dr. Thornton himself, looking haggard and defeated, admitting mistakes but claiming he'd acted within standard of care, that he'd believed Margaret's diagnosis was correct, that he'd never intended harm. But it rang hollow after Margaret's testimony. After Sarah's descriptions of lucid moments ignored, after Linda's documentation of deliberate isolation, after Diane's testimony about the culture of prioritizing revenue, the defense felt like theater, like going through motions everyone knew were empty. Closing arguments took an entire day. Victoria was methodical, walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece, the medical records showing Margaret's improvement, the memos discussing revenue optimization, the emails blocking David's attempts to visit, the systematic pattern across 23 patients, the 6 deaths that might have been prevented. She made it impossible to see this as anything other than what it was: deliberate, systematic. Evil masked as healthcare. Bradford's closing was damage control. He admitted mistakes were made, said Health Corp took full responsibility for communication failures, promised reforms were already underway. But he argued that mistakes didn't equal conspiracy, that incompetence wasn't the same as malice, that the plaintiffs hadn't proven intentional harm, just negligence. And negligence, while regrettable, didn't justify the enormous damages being sought. The jury got the case on day 10. They deliberated for 2 days. 48 hours of waiting that felt like 48 years. Sarah couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, just paced the apartment and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong, all the families depending on them, all the people watching to see if the system could still deliver justice. David was calmer on the surface, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, in the way he couldn't sit still, in the way he kept checking his phone, even though Victoria had said they wouldn't hear anything until the jury reached a verdict. Margaret was the steadiest. She read, walked, made tea, moved through the days with a serenity that came from having already survived the worst, from knowing that regardless of outcome, she'd stood up, she'd spoken, she'd refused to be silent. That had value beyond any verdict. The call came at 3:17 on a Thursday afternoon. The jury had reached a verdict. They needed to be at the courthouse in an hour. Sarah's hands shook so badly she couldn't button her coat. David had to help her. They collected Margaret, called for a car, made the drive through Manhattan traffic that had never felt slower. The courthouse was chaos again. Media everywhere, protesters, advocates, police keeping order. Victoria met them at the entrance. Her face gave nothing away. She ushered them inside, up to the courtroom, to seats at the plaintiff's table. The other families filed in. Linda sat directly behind Sarah, Diane behind David, all of them bound together in this moment, in this verdict that would define everything they'd fought for. The jury entered. Sarah tried to read their faces. Couldn't. They looked tired, serious. But whether that meant success or failure was impossible to know. The foreperson stood. A man in his 50s. Teacher, Sarah remembered from jury selection. He held a paper in his hands. Judge Walsh asked if they'd reached a verdict. He said yes. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel David's hand gripping hers so tight it hurt, could sense Margaret's absolute stillness beside them. Everything narrowed to this moment, this word, this answer to the question they'd been asking for months. On the count of medical fraud, how do you find? The foreperson's voice was clear. We find the defendants guilty. The courtroom erupted. Judge Walsh banged her gavel, called for order. But the sound kept building. Relief, anger, joy, grief. All of it pouring out at once from families who'd waited years for someone to say that word. Guilty. That what happened to them mattered. That the system had finally acknowledged their pain. The verdicts continued. Guilty on elder abuse, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on wrongful death for the 6 patients who died, guilty on every count, complete, total, undeniable victory. The jury hadn't just believed them, they'd believed them so completely that there was no room for doubt. Then came damages. $47 million, the largest settlement in New York State history for elder care abuse, split among the families, among Linda and Diane for wrongful termination. Among the estates of the 6 who died, enough to change lives, to provide security, to compensate as much as money ever could for what had been stolen. But more than the money, there were criminal charges. The district attorney had been watching, had filed charges based on the evidence presented at trial. Dr. Thornton would face 8 years in federal prison. The former administrator 6 years. Health Corp faced additional fines. $120 million. Required reforms across all 37 of their facilities. Oversight, accountability, consequences. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't process. David was crying openly. Margaret sat very still, tears streaming down her face, but her expression was one of absolute peace. Victory, justice. After everything, after all the pain and fear and uncertainty, they'd won. Completely. Undeniably. The system had worked. Truth had mattered. Showing up had been enough. The courtroom slowly emptied. Families congratulated each other, hugged, cried, celebrated. The media wanted interviews, but Victoria shooed them away. Not today. Today was for the families, for letting the victory sink in, for acknowledging that this had cost them and they'd paid the price anyway because some things mattered more than comfort. Outside the courthouse, Margaret made a brief statement. Brief, but powerful. She stood at a microphone with David on one side and Sarah on the other, faced the cameras and the crowd and the world watching through screens. Today, justice was served. Not just for me, not just for the 23 families represented in this case, but for every person who's ever been in a care facility and wondered why their family stopped visiting. For everyone who's trusted a system that betrayed that trust. For the 6 people who died because profit mattered more than their lives. She paused. Let that sink in. Then continued. But this verdict is just the beginning. The real work starts now, making sure this never happens again. making sure every facility prioritizes people over profit, making sure every elderly person has someone who shows up, someone who remembers them, someone who fights for them when they can't fight for themselves. Another pause to everyone watching. If you have someone in care, be that person. Show up, ask questions, trust your instincts. Don't let anyone tell you that your presence doesn't matter. It matters more than anything. It might save a life. It might save your own soul. Show up. Always show up. The clip went viral again, played on every news station, shared millions of times. Margaret's face, determined and unbroken, became the symbol of a movement, of families demanding better care, of elderly people refusing to be invisible, of a system finally being forced to change. That night, back at the apartment, they sat together in exhausted silence, too overwhelmed to celebrate, too drained to do anything but exist in the aftermath. Margaret fell asleep in her chair. Sarah and David moved to the balcony, looked out at the city that suddenly felt different, like something had shifted, like the world was slightly better than it had been that morning. "We did it," David's voice was wondering. "We actually did it." "You did it," Sarah corrected. "You refused to settle. You fought when everyone said to take the money and walk away. You made this happen." "We made this happen." David took her hand. "All of us. Together. That's the only way any of this worked." They stood in silence for a while. Then David spoke again, his voice tentative. "What happens now?" Sarah didn't have an answer. The trial had consumed them for so long that life after felt unimaginable. What did normal look like? What did they do with days that weren't filled with depositions and testimony and fear? How did they move forward when the thing that had bound them together was finished? But then she looked through the window at Margaret, asleep and at peace. A woman who'd lost 4 years and gotten justice, who'd stood up when standing up was terrifying, who'd transformed personal trauma into systemic change. And Sarah realized the work wasn't finished. Justice was just the beginning. The conversation about the foundation happened over breakfast 2 weeks after the verdict. Margaret had been quiet since the trial ended, thoughtful, processing everything. Then one morning she looked up from her coffee and spoke. "I've been thinking about what comes next, about what we do with the settlement money, about how we honor the people we couldn't save." David set down his fork. "Tell us." Margaret's voice was certain, clear. "I want to start a foundation for people in nursing homes who don't have family, who don't have anyone checking on them, making sure they're treated right. I want to hire advocates, people like Sarah used to be, people who actually care, send them into facilities to be watchdogs, angels, to make sure no one else gets forgotten." She looked at both of them. "I'm 74 years old. I've lost 4 years I'll never get back. But I have time left. Good time. Clear time. I want to use it for something that matters. I want to make sure the 6 people who died didn't die for nothing. That the 23 families who fought this battle created something lasting. Something that changes the system for everyone." David's eyes were bright. "Mom, that's perfect. That's exactly right." Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Purpose, direction, the answer to what came next. "Yes, absolutely yes, I'll help. Whatever you need, I'm in." Margaret smiled, reached across the table to take both their hands. "Then let's get started." The Never Forgotten Foundation incorporated 3 months after the verdict. Margaret used her settlement money as seed funding. David contributed matching funds. The other families donated portions of their settlements. Within 6 months, they had enough to hire staff, rent office space, begin training advocates. Sarah finished her nursing certification with tuition David insisted on paying, became the foundation's first director of patient advocacy. Linda was hired to train new advocates. Diane joined as healthcare systems consultant. They started small, 5 facilities in New York, 10 trained advocates. But word spread. Families contacted them. Facilities requested assessments. Media covered their work. By the end of the first year, they had advocates in 12 states, 47 trained volunteers monitoring 89 facilities. They'd helped reunite 12 families who'd been kept apart through deception. Opened investigations into 3 facilities showing similar patterns to Maplewood. Gave testimony to Congress about needed reforms. But more than statistics, they gave people hope, showed that the system could change, that individuals fighting together could take on corporations and win, that showing up mattered, that being remembered mattered, that love, real love, the kind that shows up and stays in fights, could win against profit and indifference and institutional cruelty. The pregnancy happened during the foundation's first year. Sarah had been so focused on the work that she'd missed the signs: exhaustion, nausea, the way her body felt different. It was Margaret who finally said something, asked if Sarah had considered the possibility. Sarah hadn't. The thought seemed impossible. Life was too chaotic, too full of work and purpose and building something meaningful. How could there be room for more? But she took the test, saw the positive result, sat in the bathroom of the apartment that had become home and tried to process what it meant. She was pregnant. She and David were having a baby. In 9 months, there would be a child. A new life built from all this trauma and fighting and choosing each other again and again. She told David first, watched his face transform, shocked to joy, to fear, to something that looked like wonder. Then they told Margaret together, showed her the test, watched her process it. The silence stretched long enough that Sarah started to worry. But then Margaret's face crumpled. She started crying. Happy tears. Overwhelming tears. A baby. She kept saying it. A baby. I thought I'd lost everything in that place. My mind, my son, my future. But look at us now. Look at what we've built. And now a grandchild. They tried to take my family, and instead we made a bigger one. The months of pregnancy were busy, the foundation growing, Sarah's body changing, David learning to be present not just for his mother, but for Sarah, for this new life they were creating. He'd take Sarah to doctor appointments, go with her to shop for baby things they didn't need yet but wanted anyway, sit with her on the balcony and talk about names and fears and the weight of bringing a person into a world that was beautiful and broken in equal measure. Margaret prepared too. Knitted blankets, made plans, talked about teaching her grandchild all the things she wished she'd had time to teach David better. How to show up, how to see people, how to fight for what matters, how to build a life around something other than work and money, how to measure success in presence rather than profit. Sarah thought about her mother constantly during the pregnancy, wished she could have met David, could have seen the foundation, could have known that her daughter had found purpose in the same place she'd found it, in showing up, in caring, in being present for people who needed someone to remember them, that the hospice nurses who'd cared for her had planted something in Sarah that grew into this, into a life that mattered. The baby arrived on a Tuesday morning in May. Elena Rose. Elena for Margaret's mother. Rose for Sarah's mother. 8 pounds, 6 ounces. Healthy. Perfect. Impossible. David held her and cried. Sarah held her and felt something click into place. A completeness she hadn't known was missing. Margaret held her great-granddaughter and told her about showing up, about being remembered, about fighting for what matters. The baby slept through all of it, completely unaware of the battles that had been fought to bring her into this strange chosen family. They brought her home to the apartment that had housed their trauma and healing, set up a nursery in what used to be Sarah's room, learned to be parents with Margaret as their guide, learning that love was showing up at 3 a.m. when you were exhausted beyond words, that care was changing a diaper for the 1,000th time, that presence was holding a crying baby and not needing them to stop crying, just being there, being steady, showing up. 1 year after Elena's birth, the foundation held its grand opening in a larger space, a celebration of growth and impact. 73 trained advocates now, 18 states, 140 facilities being monitored, 29 families reunited after discovering they'd been deliberately isolated, 15 investigations opened into suspected abuse, 3 facilities shut down, 1 state passing legislation requiring independent oversight of all care facilities. Real, measurable change. Margaret spoke at the event. 75 years old now, walking without assistance, sharp and present and radiating the kind of strength that came from surviving things that should have destroyed her. She stood at the podium with David, Sarah, and baby Elena beside her, looked out at the crowd of advocates and families and supporters who'd made this possible. When I was trapped in that fog, I thought love had forgotten me, that I was alone, that I didn't matter anymore. But love never forgets. My son found me, Sarah found me, and together we found our purpose. This foundation is for everyone who's been forgotten, for every person who needs someone to show up, for every family being lied to, for every elderly person wondering if they still matter. She paused, looked around the room. The answer is yes. You matter. Every single one of you matters. And this foundation exists to make sure you never forget that, to make sure someone is always showing up, always remembering, always fighting. Another pause. Her voice got stronger. They took 4 years from me. They took my clarity. They took time with my son. They almost took my hope, but they didn't take my voice. They didn't take my will to fight. And they didn't take my certainty that every person deserves dignity, deserves care, deserves to be remembered. Final pause. And now we have this. This foundation, these advocates, this movement, born from pain but built on love, and we're just getting started. The crowd stood, applauded, some crying, some smiling, all of them bound by the knowledge that showing up had mattered, that fighting had been worth it, that love, stubborn and persistent and refusing to give up, really did win in the end. After the event, they went to Luna's diner, full circle, back to where everything had started that Thursday afternoon when Margaret and David had walked through the door and Sarah's world had reorganized itself around this fight and these people. Doris was still running the place, still making sure the coffee was hot and the bacon crispy, and people who needed a place to belong found one. She fussed over Elena, called her my Luna's diner baby, insisted breakfast was on the house, settled them in the corner booth where Margaret had first recognized Sarah, where everything had changed. They ordered. Margaret got a Denver omelet. Sarah got French toast. David got 3 eggs scrambled with wheat toast. Elena slept in her carrier, oblivious to the significance. Doris brought coffee without being asked, set it down with a knowing smile. Look at you 3, you've come so far. Changed the whole damn system, made the news, made a difference, made me proud. Sarah felt tears threaten. We couldn't have done it without you, without this place, without the break you gave me that day. Doris waved a hand. All I did was let you take a moment when you needed it. You did the rest. You and this beautiful family you built. They ate breakfast as morning light filled the diner. Other customers came and went, life continuing in its ordinary way. But in that corner booth, 3 people who'd been brought together by cruelty sat with a baby born from their healing and acknowledged how far they'd come. From that first moment of recognition, through depositions and testimony and verdict, through founding a foundation and changing laws and making sure no one else lost what they'd lost. Margaret held Elena while Sarah and David ate, looked at her great-granddaughter with wonder. You'll never understand what you mean, what you represent. You're the future we thought we'd lost, the hope we had to fight for, the proof that showing up matters, that love matters, that we matter. Elena made a small sound in her sleep. Margaret smiled, continued speaking softly. Your great-grandmother is going to teach you things. How to see people, how to show up when it's hard, how to fight for what matters, how to measure success in presence instead of profit, how to be someone who remembers, who cares, who makes a difference just by being there. David and Sarah watched, listened, let Margaret have this moment, this passing on of wisdom, this connecting of past to future. Elena would grow up hearing stories about the fog, about the fight, about what it meant to stand up against systems that didn't value you, about how 3 imperfect people had refused to be silent and had changed everything. After breakfast, they walked, slowly, taking in the Brooklyn morning. Margaret pushed Elena's stroller with David on one side and Sarah on the other. They didn't talk much, didn't need to, just existed together in comfortable silence, in the knowledge that they had each other, that they'd built something that would outlast them, that their showing up had mattered not just for them, but for everyone who came after. Later, back at the apartment, Margaret sat on the balcony with the city spread below. Sarah found her there, sat beside her. They watched the afternoon deepen into evening, the lights starting to come on, each one representing a life, a story, a person trying to matter in a world that often didn't see them. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't remembered? Margaret's question was quiet. If I hadn't held on to the name of this diner, if I'd forgotten you completely? Sarah thought about it. The sliding doors of possibility, all the ways this could have gone differently. But we'll never know. You did remember, you did find me, and here we are. Here we are, Margaret repeated, building something that matters, making sure no one else gets forgotten, using pain to create purpose. That's not nothing, is it? That's everything, Sarah's voice was certain. That's exactly what it should be. They sat together as the city transformed under darkness into a constellation of lights. Inside, David was singing badly to Elena. The sound drifted out to the balcony, made both women smile. This life they'd built from broken pieces. This family formed not by blood, but by choice, by showing up again and again until showing up became love. Margaret spoke one more time, her voice thoughtful. They tried to make me disappear, tried to erase me, turn me into nothing but a billing code and a diagnosis. But I'm still here. We're all still here. And we're making noise, making change, making sure that what happened to us becomes a lesson that helps everyone else. That's revenge of the best kind, not hurting them back, but proving they couldn't destroy us, that we matter more than they ever gave us credit for. Sarah nodded, took Margaret's hand. We matter. All of us. Every person in every facility. Every family being lied to. Every advocate showing up. All of it matters. And sometimes that's enough. Margaret squeezed back. Sometimes mattering is the whole point. The evening deepened. The city hummed its eternal song. Inside, David's singing gave way to the comfortable sounds of home. Outside, two women sat together and acknowledged the distance they'd traveled. From that first moment of recognition in a diner to this moment on a balcony overlooking a city that felt different because they'd changed it. Not completely, not perfectly, but measurably, meaningfully. Sarah thought about her mother, about the promise to show up, to care, to be present. She'd kept that promise, had let it guide her through loss and firing and fear and fighting, had let it bring her to this, to Margaret, to David, to Elena, to work that mattered, to a family that felt like home, to a life built around something other than survival. Margaret thought about the fog, about being lost, about crying for David in the darkness and believing he'd forgotten her, about Sarah's hand holding hers through the worst of it, about the moment she'd walked into Luna's diner and seen a face she'd held onto through 4 years of enforced forgetting, about justice, about purpose, about the foundation that would outlive her, about great-granddaughters sleeping inside, about having won not just in court, but in life, about being remembered. They sat until the cold drove them inside, found David in the nursery with Elena, all 4 of them together in the small room that smelled like baby powder and hope. They didn't speak, just existed. Let the moment be what it was. Imperfect, beautiful, hard-won. Theirs. This was what showing up had bought them, not perfection. Not the erasing of past pain, but presence, connection, purpose. A family built from choice and pain and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. A foundation helping thousands, laws changing, systems reforming, and most importantly, the knowledge that they mattered, that their fight had been worth it, that love, real love, the kind that shows up and stays in fights, had won. Some things you never forget. Some people mark you so deeply that even fog and medication and time can't erase them. Margaret had marked Sarah. Sarah had marked Margaret. David had learned to mark them both, and together they'd mark the world, left an imprint that would echo forward, that would help people they'd never meet, that would make showing up a little easier for everyone who came after. Margaret looked at her family, her son who'd learned to be present, her daughter in all but blood who'd shown her what love looked like, her great-granddaughter who represented futures they'd fought to make possible. And she smiled, a real smile, unguarded, complete. They tried to take everything from me, her voice was soft. But look at what we built instead. Look at what refusing to be forgotten created. This family, this foundation, this proof that love always wins if you're stubborn enough to keep showing up. David moved to embrace his mother. Sarah joined them, Elena between them, oblivious to the significance, but held in the center of it anyway. 4 people, 3 generations, all proof that showing up mattered, that being remembered mattered, that fighting for dignity and care and the basic human right to be seen was worth whatever it cost. Outside, the city continued. Inside, this family held each other. And somewhere, in facilities across 18 states, advocates were showing up, checking on people, making sure they were seen, remembered, valued, carrying forward the mission that had started with one woman's refusal to be forgotten, one son's determination to make amends, one caregiver's insistence that everyone deserved someone who showed up. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still facilities that needed reforming, still families being lied to, still people forgotten by systems that valued profit over people. The work would never be completely finished, but it had started. Momentum had built. Change was happening because 3 people had refused to be silent, had stood up when standing up was terrifying, had shown up for each other and kept showing up until showing up changed everything. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was always enough. Not solving everything, not fixing every broken system, just showing up, being present, fighting for what mattered, refusing to let anyone be forgotten, proving that love, stubborn and persistent, and absolutely refusing to quit, really did win in the end. The ones who show up. That's what Margaret had named the foundation after Sarah suggested it, because that's what this was all about. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, just the quiet courage of being present, of caring when caring was hard, of remembering when forgetting was easier, of fighting when fighting seemed impossible. The ones who show up, the ones who refuse to let anyone be forgotten, the ones who prove again and again that presence matters more than profit, that dignity matters more than convenience, that every person, regardless of age or ability or economic value, deserves someone who remembers them, someone who cares, someone who shows up. Always. In the nursery, with evening becoming night and the city glowing below, and family held close and purpose found and justice won, that truth settled over all of them like a blessing, like a promise, like the answer to every question they've been asking. Show up, remember, fight, love wins, always. And they would. They'd keep showing up. For each other, for the people they served, for everyone who needed someone to see them, to value them, to refuse to let them be forgotten. They'd show up until showing up became the new normal, until every facility valued people over profit, until every elderly person had someone fighting for them, until the system changed so completely that what happened to Margaret could never happen again. That was the mission, the purpose, the reason for everything. And they were just getting started. The ones who show up, now and always, for everyone, forever. Because that's what love does. It shows up, it stays, it fights, and it wins. Always.